Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been debating whether to share this for 8 years now. I'm not looking for validation or trying to convince anyone. I just need to get this off my chest because it still haunts me. And maybe writing it down will help me process what happened that day in the Colorado wilderness. I'm an experienced hunter, been doing it since I was 12 with my dad and grandfather. By October 2015, I'd been hunting solo for over a decade and knew my way around the backcountry. I'd taken down plenty of elk before, so when I planned a solo hunting trip to the Flat Tops wilderness that fall, it was nothing unusual for me. The first couple days were uneventful. Perfect weather, clear skies, temperatures in the low 40s during the day. I set up my base camp about 4 miles from the nearest access road, far enough to be in good elk territory, but not so remote that I couldn't hike out in a day if needed. The area was gorgeous that time of year. Aspens had turned golden, mornings had that crisp fall bite to the air. On the third morning, I woke before dawn, made coffee on my small stove, ate some oatmeal, and headed out. By mid-morning, I'd spotted a decent-sized bull elk about 300 yards downslope from my position. I spent nearly an hour stalking closer, using the terrain and wind direction to my advantage. Finally got within about 150 yards, a comfortable shot with my 7mm Remington, and took him down with a clean shot through the lungs. That's when everything was still normal. Just another successful hunt. I remember feeling that familiar mix of excitement and respect as I approached the animal. He was a good-sized bull, probably 500 pounds. I took some photos with my phone before getting to work. I'd been field dressing the elk for maybe 20 minutes, my hands already bloody past the wrists when something changed. Hard to explain exactly what I felt first, just a sensation that made the hair on my neck stand up. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize you're being watched? It was like that, but amplified. Something primal and deep in my brain was screaming at me. I slowly straightened up from my work and scanned the area. Nothing at first. Just the typical forest surroundings, pines, aspens, underbrush. Then I looked up toward a slope about 80 yards away, and that's when I saw it. I've spent countless hours in the woods. I know what bears look like. I know what moose look like. This wasn't either of those. It was standing upright on 2 legs at the edge of a stand of pines. Massive. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over what I'd consider human height. Had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in what looked like black or very dark brown hair, thick all over its body. The shoulders were incredibly wide, proportionally much wider than a human's. What struck me most was that it didn't really have a visible neck. Its head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders, and its arms, they hung down way too far, almost to its knees. I'm not using the word lightly, but what I was looking at was a Bigfoot. I'd never believed in them before. Thought they were bullshit stories, but in that moment, staring at this creature, I knew exactly what I was seeing. My rifle was leaning against a nearby tree, maybe 6 feet away from me. I slowly moved toward it, never taking my eyes off the creature. I grabbed the rifle but didn't raise it or aim. Some instinct told me that would be a mistake. We just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. I blinked, and it was gone, vanished. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that the excitement of the hunt had somehow messed with my mind. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, coming toward me. The sound was getting closer fast. Whatever this thing was, it moved through thick brush at a speed that seemed impossible, breaking branches and crushing vegetation that would stop or at least slow down any human. I made a split-second decision that I still question today. I abandoned most of the elk. Just cut away the backstraps and some choice cuts, stuffed them in my pack, grabbed my rifle and started moving uphill toward my camp as fast as I could. I didn't run, the terrain was too difficult for that, but I moved at the quickest pace possible while staying upright. The entire time I could hear it behind me. Sometimes it seemed to fade a bit, but then it would get louder again. It was tracking me, following me. I kept looking back, expecting to see it burst through the trees at any moment, but somehow it stayed just out of sight. The hike back to my camp normally took about 45 minutes. I made it in 25 that day, practically jogging the final stretch. My lungs were burning and sweat was pouring down my face despite the cool temperature. The whole time, that thing stayed behind me, never quite catching up, but never going away either. When I reached my campsite, I dropped my pack and grabbed my sidearm from my tent. A Glock 19 I always bring as backup. The rifle is great for distance, but if something's close, I want the handgun. I stood there, breathing hard, listening. For a few minutes, everything was quiet. Then I heard it, not crashing through brush anymore, but methodically circling my campsite just inside the tree line. I could hear branches snapping, but in a pattern that suggested deliberate movement rather than reckless charging. Then it started hitting trees, not running into them, but hitting them, like it was using its hands or arms to strike the trunks. Thump, thump, thump. Each impact shook the smaller trees. It was circling my camp, hitting trees as it went. Some kind of intimidation display? I don't know. I stood in the middle of my camp, rotating slowly, trying to track its movement by sound. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mouth was bone dry. I had both my rifle and my sidearm, but I knew instinctively that they might not be enough if this thing decided to charge. After about 20 minutes of this standoff, I made another decision. I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. I grabbed my pack, stuffed it with just the essentials: water, some food, my GPS, headlamp, and first aid kit. I left my tent and most of my camping gear behind. The pack still had the elk meat in it, making it heavier than I would have liked for a fast hike out. I started moving toward the trail that would take me back to my truck about 4 miles away. As soon as I started moving, I heard the creature start moving too, paralleling my path just out of sight in the trees. Sometimes it would get ahead of me, sometimes fall behind, but it was always there. After about a mile of this nerve-wracking hike, I stopped. My pack was heavy with the elk meat, slowing me down. Whatever this thing was, it seemed fixated on me, and I was afraid it would eventually make a move. I needed to be faster. I set my pack down on a fallen log, the elk meat still inside. Then I backed away about 20 feet, keeping my rifle ready. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then the brush at the edge of the trail parted. It emerged partly into the open, and I saw it clearly for the second time. Standing upright, massive, its dark eyes fixed not on me, but on my pack. It seemed even bigger up close. The shoulders alone had to be twice the width of mine. Its hair wasn't uniform, longer in some places, especially on its shoulders and down its back. The face was... I struggled to describe it. Not quite human, not quite ape, something in between and altogether different. I stood completely still, barely breathing. The creature seemed to glance at me briefly, but showed no aggression or even particular interest. Instead, it reached out with one enormous hand, not paw, and picked up my entire pack with ease. A pack that weighed at least 60 pounds with the meat inside. Then it turned and disappeared into the forest, taking my pack with it. The whole encounter lasted maybe 15 seconds, but I remember every detail with perfect clarity. I stood frozen for at least a minute before I could move again. Then I practically ran the remaining 3 miles back to my truck. I kept expecting to hear it following me again, but there was nothing, just the sound of my own labored breathing and pounding footsteps. I reached my truck as the sun was starting to set, threw my rifle in, and got the hell out of there. I drove non-stop for 2 hours before I even felt safe enough to pull over at a gas station. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? I told my wife and friends I'd had a run-in with an aggressive bear and had to abandon my campsite. I never went back for my gear. Whatever that thing was, it could keep my tent and sleeping bag. The thing that still bothers me the most, that keeps me up at night sometimes, is that it could have easily taken me instead of my pack. It was faster than me, stronger than me, and had every opportunity, but it just wanted the meat. It tracked me for miles, terrified me half to death, only to take the elk meat and disappear. I've never gone back to that part of the flat tops. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in that area. I've read about Bigfoot encounters since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Some accounts describe them as curious, others as aggressive. Mine seemed purposeful. It wanted the elk meat and it got it. Simple as that. I don't expect anyone to believe this. I wouldn't have believed it myself before that day, but I know what I saw. I know what happened, and I still don't know why it didn't take me instead of my pack. Story 2. I've never been the type to believe in monsters. Hell, I've been hunting since I was 12. Spent 6 years in the army, and I've slept under more stars than most people ever see in their lifetime. But what happened last month at the Henderson Creek cabin has me questioning everything I thought I knew about these woods. My wife Lisa and I had been planning a weekend getaway for months. We both needed to disconnect from our jobs. No cell phones, no emails, just us and nature for 3 days. We found this little cabin online about 4 hours from home, tucked away in Henderson National Forest. The photos showed a cozy place with a fire pit, surrounded by dense pines and a ridge that ran along the back of the property. We arrived around 7 in the evening on Friday. The drive up the dirt road was longer than expected, and the rental agent's directions were about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already setting behind the ridge. The place looked just like the photos, rustic, isolated, perfect. After unloading the car and getting settled, I got a fire going in the wood stove while Lisa unpacked our groceries. We made a simple dinner, had a couple beers, and just enjoyed the quiet. No traffic noise, no neighbors, nothing but the occasional hoot of an owl or rustling in the underbrush. By 11, we were both pretty tired from the drive and decided to turn in. The bedroom was at the back of the cabin with a window facing the ridge. I remember lying there almost drifting off to sleep when I heard it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. It started as a distant sound that quickly grew into something I can only describe as a woman's scream mixed with something wrong. It was high-pitched, but had this underlying depth to it, almost like two sounds layered on top of each other. And it was loud. Loud enough that Lisa, who was almost asleep beside me, sat bolt upright and grabbed my arm. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her fingers digging into my bicep. "I don't know," I said, already getting out of bed and moving toward the window. "Maybe someone's hurt." The cabin had these old metal-framed windows that were impossible to open quietly. As I worked the latch, we heard it again, that same horrible scream howl. This time I could hear dogs barking frantically up on the ridge, maybe a quarter-mile behind our cabin. I've heard people in pain before, both in combat and in accidents. This wasn't that. This wasn't human. But it wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard either. It was drawn out, lasting maybe 6 or 7 seconds, and had this quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Robert, is that a woman? Should we call someone?" Lisa was already reaching for her phone. "I don't think that's human," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "But I don't know what animal makes that sound either. Having grown up in rural Montana, I've heard just about every predator that roams the American wilderness. Coyotes have that yipping howl that rises and falls. Mountain lions can scream, but it's shorter, more of a screech. Elk bugle, bears roar. But this was different. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack and shined it out the window toward the ridge. The beam barely penetrated the darkness between the trees. The sound came again, from roughly the same location as before. I'd estimate it was maybe between 200 and 750 feet away, up on the ridge, not moving much. "It's staying in one spot," I whispered to Lisa, who had pulled on her robe and was standing behind me now. "What is it?" she asked again, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I've never heard anything like it." The dogs up on the ridge were going absolutely ballistic now. Must have been at least 3 or 4 of them, probably from one of the properties further back in the woods. They sounded terrified, not aggressive, the kind of barking dogs do when they're afraid and trying to warn off something dangerous. Another scream tore through the night, somehow even louder than before. It had this pattern to it. It would start high, almost like a whistle, then drop into this guttural, resonant tone before rising again at the end. The whole thing lasted way too long for comfort, maybe 6 or 7 seconds each time. I tried to think rationally. Bobcats can make weird sounds, but this was too sustained. Foxes can scream, but not with that depth. A coyote pack might make various calls, but this was clearly a single creature, and it was big. Whatever was making that sound had some serious lung capacity. Lisa was trembling beside me. "Should we leave?" she asked. I considered it. Our car was right outside. We could be on the main road in 20 minutes. But driving unfamiliar mountain roads in the pitch black didn't seem like the safest option either. "Let's wait," I said. "It's not getting closer, and the cabin's solid." I checked the door and windows anyway, making sure everything was locked up tight. The screaming continued at regular intervals, about 15 to 20 seconds apart. Always from the same general area, maybe moving slightly, but not approaching the cabin. After the 5th or 6th scream, something strange happened. The sound just stopped, not gradually, not fading away like whatever was making it had wandered off. It just ceased completely. The dogs quieted down too, almost at the same moment. The silence that followed was almost more unnerving than the screaming had been. We stood there for what must have been 10 minutes, just listening. Nothing. The forest had gone completely still. No owls, no rustling, nothing. "Maybe it moved on," Lisa whispered, still clinging to my arm. "Maybe," I said, not believing it for a second. I grabbed my hunting knife from my pack and placed it on the nightstand, then sat on the edge of the bed listening. Lisa eventually lay back down, but couldn't sleep. I could tell from her breathing. Around 1 in the morning, I heard something else. Not a scream this time, but heavy movement in the underbrush behind the cabin. Something big was walking parallel to the back wall, maybe 30 feet from the house. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and heavy enough to crack branches. Whatever it was, it had weight to it. I picked up my knife and moved silently to the window again. The moon had risen higher now, casting faint silver light through the trees. I strained to see movement, any shape in the darkness, but the forest was too dense. The footsteps continued for about a minute, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting. That's when I noticed the smell. Even through the closed window, a musky, pungent odor had seeped into the room, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. Lisa noticed it too and covered her nose with the blanket. "What is that?" she mouthed silently. I shook my head, still focused on the darkness outside. Then I saw it. Or rather, I saw the absence of it. A patch of darkness blacker than the surrounding night. A shape at least 7 feet tall, standing motionless between 2 pines about 40 feet from the cabin. I couldn't make out features, just a massive silhouette that seemed to absorb what little moonlight filtered through the canopy. My mouth went dry. My brain was cycling through every animal I knew existed in these woods, and nothing matched what I was seeing. Black bears don't stand that tall or that still. Moose don't have that shape. This was something else entirely. I slowly backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on that dark shape. Lisa must have seen the look on my face because she didn't ask questions, just slid further under the covers. I sat on the edge of the bed, knife in hand, watching the window for what felt like hours. Around 3 in the morning, I heard more movement, this time circling around to the front of the cabin. Heavy footsteps on the wooden porch made the floorboards creak. Something large was moving around out there, stopping occasionally, as if listening. I heard sniffing sounds, deep and guttural, near the front door. Lisa was frozen beside me, eyes wide with fear. I put my finger to my lips and gripped the knife tighter, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was out there. The doorknob rattled slightly, not like someone was trying to turn it, but like something was touching it, investigating it. After what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps moved away from the door and back down the porch steps. I heard more movement around the perimeter of the cabin, always just out of clear sight. This continued for almost an hour. Whatever it was patrolling, circling our cabin repeatedly. Around 4:30, the footsteps finally receded toward the ridge. The horrible smell gradually faded, and the normal forest sounds slowly returned. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance. A light breeze rustled the pine needles. I kept watch until dawn broke, never letting go of that knife. When morning came, we packed up quickly and silently. Neither of us wanted breakfast or coffee, we just wanted to get the hell out of there. As I loaded our bags into the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A line of footprints in the soft earth beside the cabin, heading toward the ridge. They were massive, easily 16 inches long, and unlike any animal track I'd ever seen. They had 5 toes, like a human print, but wider, deeper, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. The stride length was incredible, at least 4 feet between steps. Whatever made those tracks was huge and walked on 2 legs. We never went back to finish our weekend. We drove straight home and didn't talk much on the way. Lisa has refused to go camping since then, and honestly, I don't blame her. I've tried researching what we experienced, the screams, the size, the behavior, and keep coming back to stories I used to laugh at, stories about creatures in the woods that shouldn't exist. I still don't know what was out there that night. I don't know if I want to know, but sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear that scream again in my head, that horrible, unnatural sound that was somehow both a woman's scream and something much, much worse. And I wonder if it's still up there on that ridge, watching, waiting for someone else to rent that cabin. Story 3. It was February 2016, just after a big cold snap hit southeastern Oklahoma. My Uncle Dale had knee replacement surgery, and since I was between jobs, I offered to stay at his place in the Ouachita Mountains to help with his livestock until he recovered. He's got this 40-acre property with goats, chickens, and a couple horses. Nothing fancy, just a simple ranch house with a big front porch facing the pasture and woods beyond. The day it happened started like any other. I woke up around 5:30, made coffee, and headed out to do the morning feeding. Uncle Dale's place is pretty isolated. The nearest neighbor is about 2 miles away, and his driveway is half a mile of gravel winding through the trees. I always enjoyed the solitude, though. After living in Tulsa for a few years, the quiet was a nice change. The weather that day was miserable. It had rained all morning, and by afternoon, everything was soaked and muddy. I spent most of the day clearing a fallen tree that had come down near the back pasture. By 4 o'clock, I was dead tired and completely covered in mud. I remember thinking all I wanted was a hot shower and to crash on the couch. I was walking back to the house when I noticed something wasn't right. The goats were all clustered in the corner of their pen nearest the house, making this weird bleating sound I'd never heard before. It wasn't their normal noise. It was higher pitched, almost like they were screaming. At first I figured maybe a coyote was nearby. We'd had problems with them before, and Uncle Dale had lost a kid goat last fall to predators. I dropped my chainsaw by the shed and walked toward the pen to check on them. They were practically climbing over each other, trying to get away from the back fence. That's when I felt it, this weird sensation that made the hair on my arms stand up. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize you're not alone? It was like that, but 10 times stronger. I turned toward the back of the property, and that's when I saw it. There was this figure standing by the back fence of the goat pen, partially obscured by the gathering dusk and light fog that had settled in the low areas. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a shadow or a trick of the light, but then it moved. This thing was massive. I'm 6'2", and it towered over me by at least 2 feet, but it wasn't just the height that was shocking. It was the width. Its shoulders had to be twice as broad as mine, and I'm not a small guy. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and even from about 50 yards away, I could see how muscular they were. I stood frozen on the porch, trying to process what I was seeing. It was covered in what looked like dark brown or black hair, not fur exactly, more like a shaggy coat that moved with the wind. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could see that its head sat directly on its shoulders, with barely any neck. What happened next is what still gives me nightmares. This thing grabbed the top rail of the fence, a 4-inch thick piece of treated lumber, and pulled backward with one fluid motion. The wood snapped like it was nothing more than a toothpick. Then it yanked on the fence again, and I watched in complete disbelief as 2 fence posts that I knew were sunk 3 feet into the ground, pulled right out of the earth, still attached to the section of fencing. The goats went absolutely ballistic. They were screaming and trampling each other, trying to get away, and then the creature charged toward the pen. It didn't run like a person. It was more like it bounded forward, covering ground in these long, powerful strides. That's when I snapped out of my shock. I turned and ran back into the house, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Uncle Dale keeps a Winchester .306 in his bedroom closet, and I made a beeline for it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely load the damn thing. I remember dropping one of the rounds and cursing as I fumbled to pick it up off the floor. I ran back outside with the rifle, but by then, the creature was gone from the pen. The goats were still huddled in the corner, trembling. Part of the back fence was completely destroyed, pulled backward and mangled like it had been hit by a truck, but there was no sign of the thing that had done it. I stood there scanning the tree line when I heard it, this deep, rhythmic breathing coming from the edge of the woods, maybe 70 yards away. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was too controlled, too deliberate, like it was watching me, waiting. The sun was setting fast, and I wasn't about to go wandering into the woods after dark. I backed toward the house, keeping the rifle aimed in the direction of the breathing. Once inside, I locked every door and window in the place. I dragged Uncle Dale's heavy oak dresser in front of the back door for good measure. I spent the entire night sitting in the living room with the lights off, rifle across my lap, staring out the window. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something moving around the chicken coop. There was a crash, like the feed bins being knocked over, then silence. I wasn't about to go out there. When morning finally came, I did a full sweep of the property. The fence was destroyed exactly as I remembered, not a dream or hallucination. 2 posts ripped clean out of the ground, the top rail snapped like a pencil. It would have taken incredible strength to do that kind of damage. The chicken coop door had been torn off its hinges, and 3 chickens were missing. There were footprints in the mud near both locations, huge footprints, easily 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They were deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I spent that day repairing the fence as best I could and reinforcing the chicken coop. Every few minutes, I'd stop and scan the tree line, half expecting to see that thing watching me. The whole time I worked, I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder. I didn't care how ridiculous I looked. I wasn't taking any chances. That evening, I moved all the goats into the barn and locked them in securely. I considered calling someone, the sheriff, wildlife management, anyone, but what was I going to say? That I saw Bigfoot attacking my uncle's goat pen? They'd think I was crazy or drunk. Uncle Dale came back the next day. His daughter dropped him off, and he was still on crutches, moving slow. I didn't tell him right away about what happened. I figured he had enough to worry about with his recovery. But after dinner, when I was explaining about the fence and the missing chickens, he must have seen something in my face. "What else happened, Jake?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." So I told him everything. The creature, the fence, the footprints, all of it. I expected him to laugh or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, he got real quiet and stared into his coffee for a long time. Finally, he said, "I've seen them too." My stomach dropped. "Them?" He nodded slowly. "About 8 years ago, before you started coming up here regularly, it was late October, during that early cold snap we had. I was checking the north fence line on the four-wheeler when I saw 3 of them standing in the clearing by the old oak grove. 2 big ones and what looked like a smaller one, maybe a juvenile." He described seeing exactly what I had: the massive shoulders, the long arms, the way they moved with this strange, fluid grace despite their size. He said they watched him for a moment, then melted back into the forest so quickly and quietly it seemed impossible for creatures that large. "I never told anyone," he said. "Who'd believe me? But I've lost livestock every winter since then. Always blamed it on coyotes or mountain lions. Maybe that wasn't the whole truth." We sat in silence for a while after that. Finally, Uncle Dale said what we were both thinking. "It's winter. Food's scarce in the mountains this time of year. They came looking for an easy meal." I stayed at Uncle Dale's place for another 2 weeks. We didn't see the creature again, but twice we heard strange vocalizations from the north woods at night. A sound somewhere between a howl and a scream that made the horses go crazy in their stalls. We started bringing all the animals into the barn at night and installed motion sensor lights around the property. I've tried to make sense of what I saw that day. I've looked up every large animal native to Oklahoma, studied reports of black bears in the area, even considered the possibility of escaped exotic pets. Nothing matches what I saw. Nothing explains the intelligence in those movements, the deliberate way it destroyed that fence, or the feeling of being watched that I still can't shake. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I'm just saying I saw something that day that shouldn't exist according to science. Something that was too strong, too big, too aware to be any animal I know of. And the worst part is knowing it's still out there, somewhere in those mountains, watching and waiting. Story 4. I've been waiting to tell this story for a long time, but I've always been worried people would just think I was making it up. It happened back in 2005, when I was 16, living in Coston, British Columbia. Even now, 17 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was mid-July, one of those perfect summer nights, where it's warm but not hot, and the air smells like pine and earth. Me and my 2 best friends, Jake and Marcus, were hanging out like we always did, just a block from my house at the edge of the woods. My parents were cool with us being out late as long as we stayed close to home, and we knew those woods like the back of our hands, or at least I thought I did. It was around midnight, and we were just sitting on some logs we'd dragged out to make a little hangout spot. We weren't doing anything special, just talking about video games and complaining about school starting again in a couple months. The moon was bright enough that we could see each other without flashlights, and everything felt completely normal. Then we heard it, a loud snap from deeper in the forest, like someone had broken a thick branch. Not just a twig, but the kind of sound a baseball bat would make if you broke it over your knee. "What was that?" Jake asked, looking toward the trees. Marcus shrugged. "Probably just a deer or something. But I'd been in those woods practically every day since I was 10, and that didn't sound like any deer I'd ever heard. Deer are graceful. They don't snap branches that loudly." "I'm gonna check it out," I said, standing up. "Seriously? It's pitch black in there," Marcus said. I pulled out my little pocket flashlight. "I'll be fine. I'll just take a quick look." I still don't know why I went. Curiosity, I guess, or maybe just teenage stupidity. Jake and Marcus stayed behind, continuing their conversation about some new PlayStation game. I remember hearing them laugh as I walked into the tree line, and part of me wishes I'd just stayed there with them. The forest was different at night. During the day, it was bright and familiar, but now the trees created these deep shadows that my flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. The undergrowth was thick that summer, ferns and bushes everywhere. I had to push branches aside as I moved forward, trying not to make noise. I'd gone maybe 20 feet in when I got this weird feeling. You know that sensation when you realize someone's watching you? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. The hair on my arm stood up, and I froze. I slowly turned my flashlight to the left, and that's when I saw it. There was this massive figure leaning against a tree about 15 feet away from me. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a bear standing up? But no, the proportions were all wrong. This thing was huge, between 7 and 8.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a massive chest. It was just standing there, perfectly still, staring directly at me. I couldn't see details because it was partially hidden in shadow, and my flashlight wasn't strong enough to fully illuminate it, but I could see the outline clearly, a giant humanoid shape with what looked like dark fur covering its body. The scariest part was that it was watching me so intently, like it had been waiting for me. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. I was completely frozen in fear, and it just observed me. Then I managed to find my voice. "Gee, guys!" I called out, my voice cracking. "Guys, come here, quick!" I didn't dare turn away from it, but I heard Jake yell back, "What is it?" When I called out, the thing straightened up from the tree. It was even taller, standing at its full height. Then it turned and walked away, not rushing, just deliberately moving through the trees toward the road that ran along the other side of this patch of forest. That's when I panicked. I turned and ran back toward my friends, stumbling over roots and crashing through bushes. I didn't look back once. When I burst out of the trees, I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. My friends later told me my face was completely white. "Dude, what happened?" Marcus asked, standing up when he saw me. I was breathing so hard I could barely speak. There's something in there, something big." Jake looked concerned. "What? Like a bear?" I shook my head. "No way bigger, like a Sasquatch or something." They both stared at me for a second, and then Marcus laughed. "Come on, man. I'm serious," I snapped. It was right there watching me. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall. It walked away when I called you guys. They must have seen how genuinely terrified I was, because they stopped laughing. Jake grabbed his phone and turned on its flashlight. "Let's go look then," he said. "No way," I replied. "I'm not going back in there tonight." We argued about it for a bit, but I was done. I've never been so scared in my life. Eventually, we all went home, with Jake and Marcus still not fully believing me, but worried about how shaken I was. I'd never been the type to make up stories or get scared easily, so they knew something had happened. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive figure staring at me. I kept hearing noises outside my window, convinced it had followed me home. By morning, I was exhausted, but determined to prove what I'd seen. After breakfast, I met up with Jake and Marcus, and we went back to the woods. It was a bright, sunny day, which made the whole thing seem less scary, but I was still nervous. As we approached the spot where we'd hung out the night before, I immediately noticed something different. "Look," I said, pointing to the undergrowth. There were fresh paths cut through the vegetation, areas where the ferns and bushes had been trampled down. One path led directly to the spot where I'd seen the creature. "Someone could have made these," Marcus said, but he sounded less certain now. We followed one of the paths deeper into the woods. I knew exactly where to go, straight to the tree where the thing had been standing. When we got there, I pointed out more evidence. Broken branches about 7 feet up, which was way higher than any of us could reach. That's weird, Jake admitted, looking up at the snapped limbs. But that wasn't all. As we explored the area, we found more disturbing signs. About 30 feet further in, we discovered a tree that had been snapped completely in half. Not cut with a saw or an axe, literally broken in the middle, with splintered wood showing it had been done recently. Maybe it fell in a storm, Marcus suggested, but we all knew there hadn't been any storms recently. The most unsettling discovery came when we followed another one of the fresh paths. We found a medium-sized tree, about 8 inches in diameter, completely pulled out of the ground. The roots were exposed, and the dirt around them was still damp. In all my years exploring these woods, I'd never seen anything like that before. "Holy shit," Jake whispered, finally seeming to believe me. What could do this? We spent hours in the forest that day, finding more broken branches and disturbed vegetation. By the time we left, even Marcus had to admit that something strange had happened there. The physical evidence was undeniable, but the story doesn't end there. 3 nights later, Marcus was staying at his grandparents' place, so it was just me and Jake hanging out. We were walking home around 11 at night, about 400 yards from that same patch of forest. It had been a clear day, but as evening fell, this extremely dense fog had rolled in, the kind where you can barely see 10 feet in front of you. We were walking along the road, joking about how it looked like a horror movie, when we both heard it at the exact same time, crashing sounds coming from the forest. Not just small noises, but the sound of something massive moving through the trees, breaking branches and trampling undergrowth. We stopped dead in our tracks. "You hear that?" Jake whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. The sounds continued for about 5 minutes, getting closer then further away, like whatever was making them was moving parallel to the road we were on. We couldn't see anything through the fog, which made it even more terrifying. Then suddenly, the noises stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the crashing. We stood there for what felt like forever, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. "Let's get out of here," I finally said, and we practically ran the rest of the way to my house. Later that week, we tried to look up information about Sasquatch sightings in our area. Turns out there had been several reports over the years from the mountains around Coston, but nothing in our immediate area. We never told many people about what happened. Who would believe us? But the 3 of us know what we experienced. I moved away from Coston after high school, and I haven't been back to those woods since. Sometimes I try to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was just a bear or some weird shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But then I remember the broken trees, the uprooted trunk, and that massive figure staring at me in the darkness, and I know what I saw. The weirdest part, in all the years since, I've never felt comfortable in forests at night. I used to love camping and hiking, but now I get this overwhelming sense of being watched whenever I'm among trees after dark. Like whatever I saw that night is still out there, waiting. I don't have any photos or videos to prove what happened. Back then, our phones didn't have good cameras, and we weren't thinking about documenting evidence. We were just terrified teenagers trying to make sense of something impossible. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still see those eyes watching me from the darkness of the forest. Story 5. I still remember how the mist hovered over the water that morning. It was summer of '97. I was 17, and my dad and I were on our annual fishing trip in northern Minnesota. We'd been doing these trips since I was old enough to hold a fishing rod. But this one changed everything. We got up super early that day, like 4:30 a.m. Dad always said the fish bite best at dawn, and I wasn't about to argue with 20 years of fishing wisdom. We loaded up our beat-up Chevy with our gear and the old aluminum canoe that had been in our family longer than I had. The canoe was nothing special, just a basic 17-footer with a couple of dents and some faded green paint. But it was reliable. By 5:30, we were already on the Vermilion River. The morning was cool, maybe mid-50s, and there was this light fog hanging over the water that made everything look sort of dreamlike. You know that feeling when the world is still asleep and it's just you? That's what it felt like. The only sounds were our paddles, gently breaking the water's surface, and the occasional call of a loon somewhere in the distance. Dad wanted to head for this bend in the river where he'd caught a massive northern pike the year before. He kept telling me about it. Nearly pulled me right out of the boat, Ethan, like he did every time we fished. I'd heard the story at least 20 times, but I never got tired of it. My dad wasn't a man of many words, so when he got excited about something, it was contagious. We paddled for about an hour, my arms starting to feel that familiar burn. Dad was in the back steering while I was up front. The river was pretty calm that morning, which made for easy going. The sun was just starting to really light up the sky, burning off some of the mist in golden patches. Around 6:30 or so, Dad spotted this little inlet off to the side of the main river, a shallow area filled with reeds and lily pads, perfect pike territory. We quietly paddled over, careful not to disturb the water too much. You learn to move silently when you fish. Any unnecessary splash can scare away your catch. We eased into the inlet, the bottom of our canoe occasionally brushing against the tops of underwater plants. Then we just sat there, motionless, scanning the water for any sign of movement beneath the surface. I remember the smell of the place, that rich, earthy wetland smell, mixed with the scent of pine from the surrounding forest. I was focused on watching a small ripple near a cluster of lily pads when I noticed movement on the bank, maybe 30 yards ahead of us near a fallen tree. At first, I thought it was a bear. We'd seen plenty of black bears in that area over the years, so it wouldn't have been unusual, but something felt off right away. The shape was dark. Yeah, but it wasn't on all fours like a bear would be. It was crouching, kind of squatting like a human would. I remember getting this weird feeling in my stomach, like when you're at the top of a roller coaster just before the drop. I nudged my dad and pointed, trying not to make any sudden movements. He squinted, then his eyes went wide. I'll never forget the look on his face, a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He'd seen it too. We both froze, barely breathing, and just watched. The thing, and I still don't know what else to call it, was methodically reaching into the shallow water at the edge of the bank. It would dip its hand in, lightning quick, and come up with something small and green. Frogs. It was catching frogs, one after another, and eating them, just popping them into its mouth like they were popcorn or something. From where we were, partially hidden by some tall reeds, we had a clear view of it. Even crouched down, you could tell it was tall. It had these incredibly broad shoulders and arms that seemed too long for its body. The whole thing was covered in this dark brown hair or fur. Not like the glossy coat of a healthy bear, but more matted and dirty looking, like it had never been washed. The hair was maybe 5 inches long in some places, shorter in others. Its hands, God. Its hands were what convinced me this wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. They were huge, with visible dark skin beneath the hair, and it had these thick fingers that looked disturbingly human-like, but larger, with noticeable nails that weren't quite claws, but definitely not human nails either. The way it used its hands to catch those frogs was almost surgical, precise and practiced, like it had done this thousands of times before. I remember staring at its head, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It had this sloped forehead with a really pronounced brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. The head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, with barely any neck visible. Its ears were small and flat against its head, nothing like a bear's rounded ears. When it ate the frogs, I could see its teeth. They weren't fangs or anything, just yellowish but otherwise normal-looking teeth. The whole time, it made no sound except for the splashing as it waded slightly deeper into the water to continue its hunting. After watching for what must have been 10 minutes, though it felt like hours, it suddenly stood up to its full height. I remember my breath catching in my throat. This thing was massive, at least 7.5 feet tall. It wasn't built like a bodybuilder or anything, but it was solid, powerful, the kind of natural strength you see in wild animals that have evolved to survive harsh conditions. And then it noticed us. It turned its head slowly, and I swear it looked right at me. Not through me or past me like an animal might, but at me, like it recognized what we were. There was intelligence in that look, awareness. My hand instinctively tightened on my paddle, knuckles going white. My dad remained absolutely still behind me. I could hear his breathing had gone shallow, but the creature didn't charge or roar or do anything aggressive. It just looked at us for maybe 5 seconds, then calmly turned and walked back toward the tree line. Not rushing, not showing any sign of fear or concern, just a deliberate walk, pushing aside branches with those long arms as it disappeared into the forest. We didn't move a muscle until we were sure it was gone. I don't know how long we sat there. Could have been 2 minutes, could have been 20. Finally, Dad whispered, "Let's go," in a voice I barely recognized. We paddled out of that inlet as quietly as we could, neither of us speaking until we were back on the main river and at least a mile downstream. Finally, Dad looked at me and said, "That was no bear. That was it." 4 words, but the way he said it, with absolute certainty, told me everything I needed to know about what we'd just witnessed. We didn't fish anymore that day. We just paddled back to our launch point in silence, loaded up the canoe, and drove back to the cabin. That night, sitting on the porch with our untouched fishing gear still in the truck, Dad asked me, "You gonna tell your friends about what we saw?" I thought about it and shook my head. They wouldn't believe me anyway. He nodded, seeming relieved. Probably best to keep it between us. And we did. For years, we never told anyone. Not my mom, not his fishing buddies, nobody. Who would believe us? We'd be the crazy Miller boys who claimed they saw Bigfoot. But we both knew what we'd seen. The thing that sticks with me most, even now, wasn't how big it was or how strange it looked. It was how at home it seemed, how it belonged there in a way that made me feel like we were the intruders. There was nothing supernatural or monstrous about it. It was just a creature living its life, catching its breakfast, completely in tune with its environment until we showed up. I've gone back to the Vermilion River many times since then, but I deliberately avoid that inlet. It feels wrong somehow, like going into someone's home uninvited. I figure it's better to leave whatever that was undisturbed in its natural habitat. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, still catching frogs in the early morning mist. I wonder if anyone else has seen it and, like us, decided to keep quiet. Or maybe it moved on long ago, pushed deeper into the wilderness by encroaching development. I'm 39 now. My dad passed away 3 years ago, heart attack while he was out chopping wood. Sometimes I think about telling my own son about what we saw when he gets older. But then I remember the look in that creature's eyes, that intelligence, that awareness, and I'm not sure if I should. Some things you just can't explain to someone who wasn't there, you know? All I know for certain is what I saw that summer morning in '97. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man in a suit, and it wasn't my imagination. Whatever it was, it belonged to that wild place in a way that humans never will. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still see those eyes looking back at me across the water, acknowledging my presence before turning away. Neither afraid nor aggressive, just aware. I've never felt more like a visitor on this planet than I did in that moment. Story 6. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it's been eating at me, and I figured if anyone would understand, it would be people on this forum. This happened back in April in Atlantic Beach, North Carolina. My wife and I love hiking and exploring the forest trails around our area. We've lived here for about 3 years, and we thought we'd discovered all the decent trails within a 30-mile radius. That Saturday started like any other weekend adventure for us. We packed some snacks, filled our water bottles, and headed out around 5 in the afternoon, figuring we had plenty of time before sunset. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold. Spring in North Carolina can be beautiful when it wants to be. We'd spent most of the day running errands, so this was our way of unwinding. We decided to check out this area near the edge of town that we'd driven past 100 times but never actually explored. Around 7:30, as the sun was starting to set, we stumbled upon what looked like an unmarked trail entrance. There was this old metal gate blocking vehicle access, but it was clearly meant for people to walk around. The path beyond it disappeared into dense woods. My wife Sarah got excited because we're always looking for new places to explore, and this looked promising. Instead of jumping right in, since it was getting dark, we decided to pull up to the gate in my truck and scope it out first. The plan was to come back the next morning when we had daylight on our side. So there we were, sitting in my Ford F-150 with the headlights pointing down the path, talking about whether this trail might connect to the state park about 2 miles east. I had the driver's side window down, resting my arm on the door while we chatted. Sarah was looking at her phone, trying to find the spot on Google Maps to see if there was any information about the trail. I remember taking a sip of water and glancing to my left, out the window, just casually looking around while we talked. That's when I saw it. I froze mid-sentence, my whole body just locked up. I couldn't speak, I couldn't move, I couldn't even breathe for what felt like forever. Sarah noticed immediately. She kept asking, "Justin, what's wrong? Justin?" Her voice sounded far away, like I was underwater or something. I physically couldn't respond. I was completely frozen, staring at the spot where I'd just seen something that shouldn't exist. After what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, I managed to turn my head to look at her. She later told me my face was completely drained of color. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. In a way, I wish that's what it had been. "I just saw a Bigfoot," I finally whispered. She laughed at first, thinking I was joking. Then she saw my expression and stopped abruptly. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice dropping to match my whisper, even though she had no idea why we were whispering. I nodded, my mouth dry. It crossed the path right there. I pointed about 20 feet ahead, where the headlights illuminated the dirt trail before it disappeared into darkness. It walked from that side to the other in 2 steps. 2 fucking steps, Sarah. I'm 6 foot tall. Whatever I saw was at least 7 feet, probably taller. It was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, more like long hair that hung from its body. Its arms were impossibly long, swinging slightly as it moved, and it moved so goddamn fast and silent. That's what keeps me up at night still. Something that big shouldn't be able to move that quietly or that quickly. The craziest part? It didn't even acknowledge our presence. The headlights were on, the engine was running, we weren't being quiet. It just walked across that 20-foot wide path like we weren't even there and disappeared into the trees on the other side. Sarah asked me if I was sure, if maybe it was a bear or a person in dark clothes. I've hunted since I was a kid. I know what bears look like. I know what people look like. This wasn't either of those things. "Do you want to leave?" she asked, her hand on my arm. I could feel her trembling slightly. That's when my brain finally kicked back into gear. Part of me, the rational part, was screaming to put the truck in reverse and get the hell out of there. But another part, the part that's gotten me into trouble my whole life, wanted to know for sure what I'd just seen. "I need to check," I said, reaching for the glove compartment where I keep my Glock 19. "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed, grabbing my arm. "If that was what you think it was, a handgun isn't going to do anything." She was right, of course, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I checked the gun, made sure the light attachment was working, and before I could talk myself out of it, I opened the door. "Lock the doors behind me," I told her. "If anything happens, honk the horn 3 times, then drive away. Don't wait for me." "Justin, this is stupid," she pleaded, but I was already stepping out of the truck. The night air hit me like a physical thing. It was warm for April, but I felt cold sweat breaking out all over my body. I approached the gate slowly, gun at my side, finger off the trigger, because despite everything, the last thing I wanted was to accidentally shoot some hiker because I was spooked. When I reached the gate, I stopped and just listened. Nothing, absolutely nothing. That's when I realized what was wrong. The forest was completely silent. No crickets, no frogs, no owls, not even the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the entire world. I've spent my whole life in and around forests. They're never silent. Never. There's always something making noise, even if it's just the wind. But not that night. That night, it was like the forest was holding its breath. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, straining my ears for any sound at all. My heart was pounding so hard, I could hear my pulse in my ears. My palms were so sweaty, I was afraid the gun would slip from my hand. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. Finally, I decided I'd done my due diligence. I started backing up slowly toward the truck, never taking my eyes off the darkness beyond the reach of the headlights. I could see Sarah through the windshield, her face pale and worried, her hands gripping the dashboard. I was about 10 feet from the truck when I heard it crack, a limb breaking in the woods to my right, the direction where the thing had disappeared. It wasn't a small twig. It sounded like something had snapped a branch as thick as my wrist. And it wasn't far away, maybe 30 yards into the trees. I don't remember running back to the truck. 1 second I was standing there, frozen by that sound, and the next I was yanking the door open and throwing myself inside, fumbling to lock it behind me. "Drive," Sarah said, her voice unnaturally calm. "We need to leave right now." I shook my head. "If that thing is out there moving around, I want to see it again. I need to be sure." "You are sure?" she insisted. "I can see it in your face. You know what you saw." She was right. I did know. But part of me still needed confirmation, needed to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. We sat there for another 20 minutes, scanning the trees with the headlights, neither of us speaking much. Sarah kept her hand on my arm the whole time. Whether to comfort me or herself, I'm not sure. Maybe both. Nothing else happened. No more sounds, no movement. Just that oppressive silence that seemed to press against the windows of the truck like a physical thing. Finally, I started the engine and put the truck in reverse. As we pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not just watched, studied. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? I knew what I'd seen, but I also knew how crazy it sounded. By the time we got home, I was already second-guessing myself, wondering if the fading light had played tricks on my eyes. But I know what I saw. 7+ feet tall, covered in dark hair, moving with a speed and silence that defied logic. It was real, and it was there, and for a brief moment our worlds intersected. I've always been a skeptical person. I believe in what I can see, touch, and verify. Before that night, if someone had told me they'd seen Bigfoot, I would have nodded politely while internally rolling my eyes. Funny how quickly your perspective can change when you're the one with the unbelievable story. It's been 5 months since that night. I haven't told many people. Who would believe me? Sarah supports me, but I can tell she's not entirely convinced of what I saw. She thinks I saw something, but she's not sold on the Bigfoot explanation. I don't blame her. The one concrete change is that I don't drive through forests at night anymore, not even on main roads. If there's an alternate route that avoids wooded areas after dark, that's the one I take, even if it adds 30 minutes to my journey. Sarah doesn't question this new habit. She understands that something fundamental changed in me that night. Sometimes I think about going back in daylight with a group of people, to look for footprints or hair or any evidence at all. But something stops me every time. Fear? Maybe. Or maybe it's the certainty that whatever was in those woods that night doesn't want to be found. I still don't know what to make of what happened. All I know is that for a few seconds on an ordinary Saturday night in April, I saw something that shouldn't exist according to everything I've been taught about the natural world. And now I have to live with that knowledge and with the question that keeps me up at night. If that thing exists, what else might be out there in the dark, just beyond the reach of our headlights? Story 7. I still question what I heard that morning. We were camping out near Julian, California, just off Highway 79. My wife and I were sharing a tent trailer with some friends. Nothing fancy, just a small group of us out in the woods trying to enjoy some time away from the city. It's been 3 weeks, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. The campsite was this little clearing surrounded by these massive old trees, the kind that block out most of the light even during the day. At night, it was seriously dark. You could see some moonlight filtering down through gaps in the canopy, but not enough to really see without a flashlight. My wife and I had been there since Friday evening. Saturday was completely normal. Hiking, cooking out, telling stories around the campfire. Nothing out of the ordinary. Saturday morning, I walked my wife to the porta potty just before dawn. It was maybe 100 yards from our trailer. Nothing unusual happened that morning. Sunday was different. I woke up around 5:30 in the morning. My wife needed to use the bathroom, so I grabbed my flashlight to walk her over. It was that weird time just before dawn when everything's still dark, but you can tell the sun is thinking about coming up. The air was chilly, maybe 45 degrees, and completely still, no wind at all. We walked in silence because nobody else in camp was up yet. The only sounds were our footsteps on the dirt path and the occasional crunch of dry leaves. When we reached the porta potty, I told her I'd wait outside. Standing there alone in the dark, I could hear every little sound in the forest. I'm not usually jumpy, but something about that stillness puts you on edge. You become hyper-aware of everything around you. That's when I heard it. Around 5:40, there was this sharp, distinct knock from somewhere north of where I was standing. Not like a branch falling or an animal rustling around. This was deliberate, like someone had taken a piece of wood and struck a tree with it just once. Knock, then silence again. My first thought was that maybe another camper was up early, setting up or something. But it was so isolated out there, and the sound came from deep in the woods, not from the direction of any campsite. I didn't think too much of it at first. When my wife came out, I didn't even mention it. We walked back to our trailer in silence. I remember noticing how much darker the forest seemed on our way back, like the trees were closing in around the narrow beam of my flashlight. Back in our trailer, we tried to go back to sleep, but I was wide awake now, listening. About 15 minutes later, I checked my watch. It was 5:55. We heard something else. This time it was a loud whoop sound coming from the east. It wasn't an animal call I recognized, not an owl, not a coyote, nothing like that. It was a single, clear sound that carried through the trees. Immediately after that whoop, a bunch of blue jays went absolutely crazy. They started chattering and squawking like something had disturbed them. This lasted maybe 20 seconds, and then they all went completely silent at once. Not gradually quiet, just suddenly nothing, like someone had flipped a switch. That silence was somehow more unsettling than the noise had been. "Did you hear that?" my wife whispered. I nodded, not wanting to speak too loudly. We both sat up in our sleeping bags, listening. The trailer suddenly felt very small and exposed. "What was it?" she asked. "Probably just an animal," I said, but I didn't believe it. Whatever made that sound wasn't any animal I was familiar with, and I've been camping in these woods for years. I decided to get up and make some coffee. No way I was getting back to sleep now. I told my wife I needed to take out our trash bag to the dumpster near the campground office. Really, I just wanted to see if anyone else was up. maybe check if they'd heard anything. The sky was starting to lighten a bit as I walked to the dumpster. Not quite dawn yet, but getting close. The forest was still unusually quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels running around, just silence. As I was heading back, I ran into Mike, one of our friends who was staying in another trailer about 50 yards from ours. He was already up with a cup of coffee in his hand. "You're up early," I said, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, heard some weird shit about 20 minutes ago. Woke me up." He took a sip of his coffee. "Like someone knocked on a tree, just once. Came from over there." He pointed west in the opposite direction from where I'd heard the first knock. "I heard something similar," I admitted. "From the north when I was waiting for Lisa at the bathroom." We stood there for a moment, both looking into the woods. Mike finally shrugged. Probably nothing, maybe some hikers getting an early start. But there was something in his voice that told me he didn't believe that any more than I did. I walked back to our trailer, feeling eyes on my back the whole way. The forest that had seemed so peaceful yesterday now felt oppressive, like it was hiding something. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone or something standing there watching me. But there was never anything. I'd just gotten back to our trailer when we heard it again. Another whoop, louder this time, coming from the southeast. This one was longer, almost like a question. Then, not even a minute later, a second whoop answered from the south. "Robert, what is that?" my wife asked, her voice tense. "I don't know," I admitted. I went to the window of our trailer and peered out, but couldn't see anything in the dim light. The sun was just starting to come up, creating weird shadows between the trees. That's when I realized what was happening. These sounds, the knocks and the whoops, they were coming from different directions: north, east, west, southeast, south, all around our campsite, like we were surrounded. And they weren't random. They were spaced out, deliberate, like signals. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or anything crazy like that. I've always been skeptical about that kind of stuff. But whatever was making these sounds, they were communicating with each other. I'm absolutely certain of that. Over the next half hour, we heard 2 more knocks and another whoop, each from different directions. The pattern was always the same: a single sound, then silence. No movement, no rustling in the bushes, nothing visible, just these isolated signals circling our camp. By 6:30, the sun was properly up and the forest seemed to come alive again. Birds started singing, squirrels appeared, and other campers began to stir. Whatever had been out there either left or went quiet. The rest of the morning was completely normal, as if nothing had happened. When we packed up to leave later that day, I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see something watching us. But there was nothing, just trees and underbrush. I asked a few other campers if they'd heard anything unusual that morning. Most had slept through it, but an older guy in an RV said he'd heard something like a hoot, but not quite right, around 6 in the morning. He'd assumed it was an owl. We've been camping in those woods dozens of times over the years, and I've never experienced anything like that before. What stands out to me wasn't just the sounds themselves, but how methodical they were. These weren't random animal noises. They came from specific directions, at specific intervals, like something was systematically signaling around our camp. I've tried to find recordings of animals that might make similar sounds, but nothing matches exactly what we heard. The closest thing to the whoops would be a howler monkey, but those obviously don't live in California forests. I keep thinking about how those sounds formed a perimeter around us, like we were being surrounded, assessed. The fact that they stopped once the sun came up makes me think whatever was out there prefers to operate in darkness. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that knock again, that deliberate knock against wood. My wife says I'm obsessing, and maybe I am, but I know what I heard, and I know it wasn't normal. We're planning another camping trip next month, but I've suggested we try a different area. My wife thinks I'm being ridiculous, but she didn't see how those blue jays just suddenly went silent all at once, like they knew something we didn't. I don't have a neat explanation for what happened that morning. All I know is that for about 45 minutes, something was communicating in a circle around our camp. And whatever it was, it didn't want to be seen. Story 8. I've never told this story outside my close circle. Even now, typing this out, my hands are a bit shaky. It happened 42 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Some things just burn themselves into your memory. You know? It was early May of 1981. I was 15, that awkward age where you're not quite a kid anymore, but definitely not an adult. My buddies Mark and Dave and I decided to go fishing at this secluded spot we'd heard about from some older kids at school. It was called the Backwaters off Indian Creek near Corridon, Indiana, about 45 minutes from where we lived. We rode our bikes there that morning, carrying our fishing poles and a small cooler with some sandwiches and sodas. It was one of those perfect spring days, not too hot, but warm enough that you didn't need a jacket. The sky was clear blue and everything was green and alive after the winter. Birds were singing and it felt great to be outside after being cooped up in school all week. The backwaters were pretty much what you'd expect. A slow-moving section of the creek that widened out into what almost looked like a small lake. It was surrounded by thick woods on three sides, with these tall oaks and maples that had probably been there for 100 years. The place was totally deserted, which was exactly what we wanted. No adults telling us what to do, no other kids to compete with for the best fishing spots. Mark and Dave immediately waded into the water with their poles. They had these old waders Mark's dad had given him, but I only had my sneakers, so I decided to walk the shoreline instead. I figured I'd find a good spot to cast from the bank. The shoreline was pretty rough, rocky in some places, muddy in others, with lots of tree roots and fallen branches to navigate. After about 20 minutes of fishing without even a nibble, I was getting bored. I could see Mark and Dave about 50 yards away, laughing about something, and decided to rejoin them. Between me and them was this thick hedge that ran along the bank for about 20 yards. It was faster to push through it than to go all the way around, so that's what I did. The hedge was dense with these thorny branches that kept catching on my clothes and scratching my arms. I had to crouch down to get through it, and I remember thinking how stupid this was, just to save a few minutes of walking. When I finally pushed through to the other side, I straightened up, brushing leaves and twigs off my shirt. That's when I saw it. I wasn't alone. Not 3 feet in front of me was something impossible, something that made my whole body go cold in an instant. It was standing upright on 2 legs like a person, but it wasn't a person, it was short. I was about 5'7" back then, and this thing was shorter than me, maybe 5'2". It was covered completely in brown hair. Not fur exactly, but more like smooth hair. Almost like a short-haired dog, but covering its entire body. The hair seemed to flow in one direction, lying flat against its body. The arms were what really struck me. They were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its hands looked almost human-like, but larger with longer fingers. The face, God, the face is what I still see sometimes when I close my eyes. It was covered in the same brown hair, though not as thick as on the rest of its body. I could make out features, dark eyes that reminded me of a dog's eyes, alert and intelligent. Its nose was flat against its face, and its mouth was closed. It didn't bare its teeth or make any sound. It just stared at me for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 seconds. We just looked at each other. I don't know which of us was more surprised. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright like that for more than a moment. It wasn't a person in a costume. We were in the middle of nowhere, and the way it moved was too natural. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen or heard of. Then, as if by some unspoken signal, we both panicked at the same time. I turned and ran back through the hedge, not caring about the thorns ripping at my clothes and skin. The creature turned and ran in the opposite direction toward the denser woods. It ran upright the whole time, not dropping to all fours like a bear or monkey would. Its arms swung naturally, like a person jogging, and it moved with these fast, smooth steps that covered ground quickly. I burst out of the hedge, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I ran toward Mark and Dave, stumbling and nearly falling twice. They saw me coming and started laughing, thinking I was just being stupid, until they saw my face. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, his smile fading. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I saw something," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "Back there in the woods." "What, like a snake?" Dave asked, already backing toward the shore. Dave was terrified of snakes. "No, like an animal, but not..." I couldn't find the words. "How do you describe something you've never seen before?" "Like a little bear, but not really. It was standing up like a person." They both stared at me, then at each other. "You're full of crap," Mark said, but I could tell he was a little freaked out. "I'm serious," I insisted. "It was right in front of me. We were face to face." "What did it do?" Dave asked, now definitely scared. "Nothing. It just looked at me, then ran away." "Probably just a raccoon or something," Mark said, but he was already reeling in his line. "You scared it. It scared you." "It wasn't a raccoon," I said, my voice rising. "It was as big as me. Almost." We argued about it for a few minutes, but I could tell they didn't believe me, or maybe they didn't want to believe me. Eventually, we packed up our stuff and headed home. We didn't catch any fish that day. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark, intelligent eyes staring back at me. I tried to convince myself it was just a bear cub or some other animal that I'd misidentified in the moment of surprise, but I knew better. I'd seen it clearly, in broad daylight, from just a few feet away. I didn't tell my parents. What would I say? "Hey, Mom, I saw a monster in the woods today." They'd think I was making it up for attention, or that I'd been smoking something in the woods with my friends. Over the next few weeks, I checked books out of the library about North American wildlife, looking for anything that matched what I'd seen. Nothing did. Not even close. Mark and Dave and I never talked about it again. We went fishing a few more times that summer, but never back to the backwaters off Indian Creek. None of us suggested it, and none of us asked why. As the years passed, I mostly put it out of my mind. College, jobs, relationships, life moved on. Sometimes I'd remember that day and wonder what I'd really seen, but I'd push the memory away. It was easier to think I'd been mistaken somehow. Then in 1997, 16 years later, I was flipping channels one night and stopped on a documentary about cryptids. You know, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, that kind of thing. I wasn't really paying attention until they showed a photo that made me drop the remote. It was blurry and obviously taken from a distance, but it showed what was supposed to be a juvenile Sasquatch, and it matched exactly what I had seen that day. The height, the proportions, the long arms, the smooth brown hair, everything. I sat there frozen as the narrator talked about reports of younger Bigfoot sightings being rare, but not unheard of, how they were typically less cautious than adults, how they might be more likely to have accidental encounters with humans. All these years, I'd tried to convince myself I'd seen something ordinary that day, some known animal that I'd just misidentified in a moment of surprise. But seeing that image brought it all back with crystal clarity. What I'd seen was no bear, no raccoon, no person in a costume. I'd come face to face with a young Sasquatch, and it had been just as startled by me as I was by it. I've never gone public with this story before now. Who would believe me? A random 15-year-old kid claims he saw a Bigfoot in the Indiana woods. I'd be laughed out of town, but I know what I saw. Sometimes I wonder what happened to that creature. Did it run back to its family and tell them about the gangly human teenager it encountered? Did it grow up to become one of those massive, elusive adults that people occasionally glimpse in the Pacific Northwest? Is it still out there somewhere, I've thought about going back to that spot many times over the years, but I never have. Part of me is afraid I wouldn't find anything, that it would just be an ordinary stretch of woods and water, and that would somehow make my memory less real. And part of me is afraid I would find something, evidence that would force me to fully confront what happened that day. So I've kept this to myself all these years. Even writing it out now feels strange, like I'm finally admitting to myself that it really happened. That for a brief moment on a spring day in 1981, two young creatures from different worlds came face to face, shared a moment of mutual astonishment, and then ran back to the safety of their own kind. And sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep, I still see those dark eyes looking into mine, and I wonder if, somewhere out there, it remembers me too. Story 9. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 2 years now. I guess I'm still trying to make sense of it myself. This happened in July of 2021, and honestly, I haven't been the same since. I've been frog gigging on the Kissimmee River since I was a teenager. My dad taught me, and it's always been something I enjoyed doing by myself. Just me, my airboat, and the sounds of Florida at night. There's a certain peace to it, you know? Or at least there used to be. That night started like any other summer night. I got my gear ready around 9, loaded up the airboat, and headed out just as the sun was setting. It was hot and sticky, classic Florida July weather. I remember swatting mosquitoes as I loaded my gear and thinking it would be a good night for frogs. I made my way south of Lake Kissimmee to one of my favorite spots. It's this area where cabbage palms grow really thick right up against the tree line. The frogs there are usually plentiful, and I've always had good luck. I'd been there dozens of times before, so I felt completely comfortable. Around 11 that night, I cut the engine and drifted into my usual position. The airboat settled against some reeds, and I poured myself a cup of coffee from my thermos. It was one of those perfectly clear nights, stars everywhere, almost a full moon, the kind of night where you can see pretty well even without a headlamp. I was just sitting there enjoying my coffee, listening to the chorus of frogs and cicadas, when something changed. It's hard to explain, but suddenly the normal night sounds just stopped. You know how the swamp is never really silent? Well, it got quiet. Too quiet. That's when I heard it, a heavy movement in the palms behind me, not like a raccoon or possum or even a gator. This was something big pushing through the vegetation. At first, I thought maybe it was a feral hog. They're all over Florida, and they can make a racket moving through brush. But then there was this loud thud. Something had hit the ground near my boat. Before I could even turn around, there was another thump, louder this time, as something struck the metal rudders at the back of my airboat. The whole boat shook slightly. I nearly spilled my coffee as I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the rudders. There was fresh mud smeared across the metal. Wet, dark mud that hadn't been there when I started out. While I was trying to process what I was seeing, another wad of mud flew through the air and hit the front of my boat, splattering across the bow. My heart started racing. Someone was throwing mud at my boat. That was my first thought. Some kids playing a prank, or maybe some drunk fisherman messing with me. I grabbed my spotlight and pointed it toward where the mud had come from. That's when I saw it. About 20 feet away, at the edge of the palm trees, there was a face staring right at me, a face that didn't belong to any human. I've spent my whole life in the Florida outdoors. I know every animal that lives in these swamps. This wasn't any of them. This thing was crouched down low, but even hunched over, I could tell it was big, way bigger than a person. Its face was broad with dark skin, almost black in the spotlight. Its eyes were deep set, reflecting my light like a deer's would, but much larger. The nose was flat and wide, and long matted hair hung down from its head and the sides of its face. The hair looked dark brown with these strange lighter patches in it, like it was sun-bleached in spots. I couldn't move. My whole body just locked up. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my legs went completely numb. I've faced down gators before, even had a close call with a bull shark in the brackish water once, but I've never felt fear like that. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing, but my body knew I was in danger. The creature didn't move either. We just stared at each other. Its shoulders were incredibly wide. Even in that crouched position, I could see the power in them. There was intelligence in those eyes too. Not animal curiosity, but something calculating, something aware. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It felt like forever, but it was probably only seconds. Then my survival instinct finally kicked in. My hands were shaking so badly I fumbled the starter cord twice before I managed to yank it. The engine roared to life, and I swear I saw the thing flinch at the sound. I cranked that throttle so hard I nearly flipped the boat. I took off northward at full speed, not caring about the wake I was causing or the noise. All I wanted was to get away from there as fast as possible. I should have gone straight home. That would have been the logical thing to do. But I was too terrified to go back to the landing where my truck was parked. What if that thing followed me? What if it was waiting in the darkness at the boat ramp? So I just stayed out on the open water until dawn, going in circles, keeping the engine running the whole time. I burned through almost a full tank of gas. When the sun finally came up, I felt safe enough to head back. I was exhausted, cold from the night air, and still shaking. I loaded my boat onto the trailer faster than I ever had before, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got home, I couldn't tell anyone what had happened, not my wife, not my buddies, nobody. Who would believe me? They'd think I was drunk or making it up. Hell, part of me wanted to believe I had imagined it all, but then I remembered the mud on my boat. I hadn't imagined that. I went out later that day and hosed down the boat. The dried mud came off easily, and I watched it wash away down the driveway. It was like I was trying to wash away the evidence, trying to convince myself it hadn't happened. But I know what I saw. That face is burned into my memory. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, seeing those eyes staring at me from the darkness. I've looked up stuff online since then, pictures, videos, reports. I never gave much thought to Bigfoot or Sasquatch before. That was something from the Pacific Northwest, not Florida. But after what I saw, I'm convinced that's what it was. Some people call it the skunk ape down here, but whatever name you give it, that's what I encountered that night. The fear I felt wasn't normal fear. It was something deeper, something primal, like my DNA remembered something my conscious mind didn't know about. I can't explain it better than that. I've changed my habits since that night. I don't go out on the water alone anymore, especially after dark. I haven't been back to that spot on the river, not once in almost 2 years. I've made up excuses when friends want to go frog gigging in that area. They think I'm being weird, but I don't care. The strangest part is trying to understand why it threw mud at my boat. Was it trying to scare me off? Was it curious about me and my boat? Was it playing some kind of game? I'll never know. And that bothers me almost as much as the encounter itself. I keep wondering if anyone else has seen it in that area. I've been tempted to ask around, but I don't want people thinking I'm crazy, so I've kept it to myself until now. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't started the boat when I did. Would it have approached me? Would it have attacked? Or would it have just melted back into the swamp? The not knowing is almost as bad as the knowing. I used to love the peace of being alone on the water at night. Now I can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I'm out there. That's the worst part of all this. It took away something I loved. It took away my peace. I don't have any photos or videos. It happened too fast, and honestly, grabbing my phone was the last thing on my mind. All I have is what I saw with my own eyes and what I felt in my gut. But that's enough for me to know what was real. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm just putting this out there because I need to tell someone, even if it's just strangers on the internet. Maybe someone else has seen it too. Maybe I'm not alone in this, but if you're ever out on the Kissimmee River at night, especially south of Lake Kissimmee, where the cabbage palms grow thick against the tree line, keep your eyes open and your engine running. And if you hear something heavy moving in the palms, or if mud starts hitting your boat, don't stick around to see what's throwing it. Story 10. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. My brother and I never really talked about it with anyone outside our immediate family, and even then, we weren't believed. But after stumbling across this community and reading similar experiences, I feel like maybe someone here will understand what happened to us that day back in '87. I was 15 at the time, and my younger brother Michael was 13. We lived in a pretty isolated spot in southern Ohio, just 3 houses on this long gravel road that dead-ended at woods and fields. Our house sat on about 5 acres that backed up to our neighbor's sheep field. The guy kept maybe 30 or 40 sheep there, and from our property, you could see most of the field if you got up high enough. That spring, I think it was late May or early June, Mike and I were working on building this tree fort in a big oak near the back of our property. We had this platform about halfway built, maybe 12 feet up, and we'd spend hours up there just messing around like kids do. Our mom had called us in for lunch earlier, but otherwise, we'd been up in that tree most of the afternoon. It must have been around 5 or 6 in the evening. The sun was still up, but starting to get lower, casting these long shadows. I remember it was warm, but not hot. Perfect weather, really. What struck me first was how quiet everything had gotten. At first, I didn't consciously notice it, but then it hit me that the birds had stopped singing completely. No insects buzzing, nothing. Just this heavy silence that felt wrong. Mike noticed it too because he stopped hammering and looked at me with this confused expression. That's when we both looked out toward the sheep field. All the sheep were clustered together on the near side of the field, which was weird because they were usually spread out grazing this time of day. They were just standing there, completely still, all facing the same direction, toward the far tree line. "What are they looking at?" Mike whispered. I don't know why he whispered, but it somehow felt necessary. I squinted, trying to see what had the sheep's attention. At first I didn't see anything, but then there was movement at the edge of the field where it met the forest. Something dark was moving low to the ground, almost crawling, coming out from the tree line. From our angle, we could see over the wooden fence that separated our property from the field, and we had a clear view of whatever this was. "Is that a bear?" Mike asked, still whispering. We didn't have many bears in our area, but it wasn't impossible. "I don't think so," I said. The way it moved wasn't right for a bear. It was more deliberate, almost stealthy, and then it stood up. I'll never forget that moment, as long as I live. This thing, this creature, rose up to its full height and my stomach just dropped. It was huge, towering, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its entire body was covered in this dark brown, almost black hair. Not fur like an animal, but hair, long and shaggy and tangled. In the evening sunlight, you could see how coarse and matted it was. It stood completely upright on 2 legs, just like a person, but there was nothing human about it. Its arms hung down much longer than a person's would, nearly to its knees. The build was massive, broad shoulders, thick torso, powerful looking. I couldn't make out facial features clearly from our distance, but the head seemed somewhat pointed at the top and sat directly on the shoulders with barely any neck visible. "Jason," Mike breathed, his voice barely audible. "What the fuck is that?" I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone completely dry. I knew what it looked like, but my brain refused to process it. We'd heard stories about Bigfoot, sure, who hadn't? But those were just campfire tales, not something you actually saw in your neighbor's sheep field on a random Tuesday in Ohio. The creature wasn't just wandering around either. It was moving with purpose, directly toward the sheep. There was an intelligence to its movements that made it even more terrifying. It wasn't a random animal. It was hunting, deliberately, methodically. Most of the sheep didn't react until it got within about 30 or 40 feet of them. Then a few at the back of the group started shifting nervously, moving away. The creature paused for just a second, then moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. One moment it was standing still, and the next it had covered the distance to the sheep in a few powerful strides. With one fluid motion, it reached out and grabbed a full-grown sheep with a single hand. Just snatched it up like it weighed nothing. The sheep didn't even have time to make a sound. The creature tucked the animal under one arm, like a person carrying a sack of potatoes, and turned back toward the trees. That's what really sticks with me. How casual it was, how practiced. This thing didn't struggle or fumble. It knew exactly what it was doing, like it had done this many times before. It just calmly walked back the way it had come, carrying a 100-pound animal under one arm like it was nothing, and disappeared into the tree line. The remaining sheep scattered in panic after it grabbed one of their own, but they didn't make much noise, just a lot of movement and some soft bleating. It was like they were afraid to draw attention to themselves. Mike and I didn't move. We didn't speak. I'm not sure we even breathed for several minutes. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had this intense feeling that if we made any noise, the thing would come back, would come for us next. We stayed frozen in that tree for at least another hour. The sun was starting to set when I finally worked up the courage to whisper that we should go back to the house. Even then, we moved so carefully, climbing down slowly, pausing to listen constantly. We ran the last 50 yards to our back door. That night, we didn't tell our parents. I'm not sure why. Maybe because we knew they wouldn't believe us. Maybe because saying it out loud would make it more real. We both slept in my room, with the baseball bat I kept from Little League propped against the bed. The next day, we went back to the field when our dad was at work, and Mom was busy with laundry. We told her we were just going to work on the fort again. I think we both needed to see if there was any evidence, anything to prove to ourselves that we hadn't imagined it. There was. We found where the grass had been trampled down in a clear path from the woods to where the sheep had been standing, and near the edge of the field, where the ground was softer, we found footprints. Not complete ones, just partial impressions, but they were unlike anything I'd ever seen, wide, much longer than a human foot, with what looked like 5 toes. The impression was deep too. Whatever made those prints was heavy. We debated telling our parents then, but ultimately decided against it. 3 days later, though, I finally broke down and told our dad. He laughed it off, said we'd probably seen a bear and our imaginations had run wild. When I insisted, showing him how tall it was by pointing at a tree, he got kind of stern and told us to stop making up stories. About 2 weeks after the incident, the farmer who owned the sheep came by our house. I overheard him talking to my dad on the porch. He was asking if we'd seen anything unusual, any strange animals or trespassers. Several of his sheep had gone missing over the past month, he said, and there were no signs of typical predators. No blood, no wool tufts scattered around, no signs of struggle. They were just gone. Dad mentioned our bear sighting, but the farmer didn't seem convinced. When he asked Mike and me directly if we'd seen anything, we both denied it. The memory was still too raw, too frightening, and honestly, who would believe us anyway? We never saw the creature again, though sometimes in the following months, we'd hear strange sounds from the woods at night. Tree knocks, weird howls that weren't coyotes or any animal we recognized. Once, about a month after the incident, something heavy walked across our backyard in the middle of the night. The dog went crazy but wouldn't go outside even when Dad opened the door. My brother and I are in our 40s now. He lives a few states away, but when we get together at holidays, sometimes we'll step outside away from everyone else and talk about what we saw that day. Our story hasn't changed in almost 30 years. We know what we witnessed. Whatever that creature was, it had hunted those sheep before. It knew exactly where they were kept, how to approach them, how to efficiently capture one without creating a commotion. I've read about supposed Bigfoot sightings over the years, but most don't match what we saw. This wasn't some shy creature that ran away when spotted. This was a predator, calculated, intelligent, and the way it moved, That unnatural speed and strength still gives me nightmares. To this day, I'm careful about remote areas. I don't go hiking alone, and when I'm somewhere quiet in the woods and the birds suddenly stop singing, that old feeling of dread washes over me, and I can't help but scan the tree line, half expecting to see that dark, shaggy figure rise up to its full height again. Story 11. I was 11 years old when it happened, back in '87. I've never been able to shake the memory, no matter how hard I try. I still get chills when I think about it. And I'm 47 now. I've only told a handful of people because, well, who would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest. And maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I grew up in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. We had this modest house with about 3 acres of land that backed up to hundreds of acres of dense woodland. My dad worked construction, and we weren't rich by any means, but we had that land, and those woods were my playground. Late August, 1987. The summer was winding down and school was going to start in just a couple weeks. It was a Thursday, I remember, because my dad was away on a 3-day job in Pittsburgh. My older brother Kevin was spending the day at his friend's house, and my younger sister Molly was sick with a summer cold, stuck in bed while my mom tended to her. I was bored out of my mind. Mom was busy with Molly, who was being extra whiny that day. Not that I blame her. Poor kid was miserable. Mom told me I could go outside, but not to go too far, since she couldn't come looking for me if I got into trouble. Now, not too far was pretty subjective when you're 11 and have spent your entire childhood exploring those woods. There was this creek about 15 minutes from our house, a little stream really, with these perfect flat rocks where I loved to sit. It wasn't deep enough to swim in, just a few inches in most spots, but it was peaceful and cool, even in August heat. I packed myself a peanut butter sandwich, no jelly because we were out, grabbed my sketchbook and colored pencils, and headed out. I remember Mum calling after me to be home before 5, and I promised I would. The walk to the creek was so familiar, I could have done it blindfolded. There was this path that wasn't really a path, just a route I'd taken so many times that I knew every route and fallen log. The woods were alive that day, birds chattering, squirrels running around, even saw a rabbit that froze when it spotted me. The air smelled like pine and that earthy scent that comes after a rain. It had drizzled the night before. I reached my favorite spot around 1 in the afternoon. There was this big flat rock right next to the creek that was like nature's perfect chair. Across from it was this old rotted stump that had the most interesting mushrooms growing on it. I'd decided weeks before that I wanted to draw it, and today was finally the day. I settled in, ate half my sandwich, and started sketching. The temperature was perfect, high 70s but cooler in the shade of the trees. Everything was so normal, so ordinary. That's what makes what happened next so much worse in my memory. I'd been drawing for maybe 45 minutes when something changed. It wasn't something I saw or heard at first. It was something I felt. Like when you're alone in a room and suddenly realize someone is standing behind you. The woods went quiet, not gradually, but all at once. 1 second, there were birds and insects making all their usual sounds, and the next, nothing. Complete silence except for the soft gurgle of the creek. I stopped drawing and looked up, pencil still in my hand. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not like a deer or a fox, those are light, quick. These were heavy but measured, like something big was trying to be quiet. Thump, pause, thump, pause. Something walking on 2 legs, not 4. My first thought was that someone from one of the farms nearby had wandered into the woods, but something felt wrong. The steps were too heavy, too widely spaced, and there was this sense of deliberateness to them. I sat completely still, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The creek was running to my left, and to my right was a hill that sloped upward. The footsteps seemed to be coming from up that hill, moving parallel to the creek, not directly toward me. I slowly turned my head to look, careful not to make any sudden movements. My heart was hammering so loud, I was sure whatever was up there could hear it. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards up the hill, something dark moved between two pine trees. At first, my brain tried to make it into a person, maybe a hunter or a hiker, but no. This thing was walking upright, but it wasn't human. It was massive. The shoulders alone were twice as wide as my dad's, and he was a big construction worker. Its arms were wrong, too long, hanging lower than a person's would, and the way it moved, it was fluid in a way that seemed impossible for something that size. It was covered in dark hair or fur. Not black, but a deep brown, almost like the color of the pine bark, but darker. I couldn't see its face clearly, thank God. But I caught the profile as it passed between the trees. It had this pronounced brow and no real neck that I could see. Just this massive head that seemed to sit right on those enormous shoulders. The strangest thing was how quiet it was for its size. I mean, I could hear the footsteps, but they were nothing compared to what you'd expect from something that big. It was deliberate, careful. It never looked directly at me. It just crossed my line of sight at an angle, moving along the ridge. I saw it for maybe 10 seconds before it disappeared behind some thick underbrush and trees. I didn't move. I couldn't. I sat there frozen, my sketchbook forgotten in my lap, pencil clutched so tight in my hand that it left marks on my palm. I kept staring at the spot where it had disappeared, terrified it would come back, or worse, that it had circled around and was now behind me. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. Finally, the distant call of a blue jay broke the silence, and it was like someone had unfrozen me. I slowly, carefully gathered my things, stuffing them haphazardly into my backpack. I left half my sandwich on the rock. I couldn't care less about it. The walk home was the most terrifying 15 minutes of my life. I didn't run. Somehow I knew running would be a mistake. Instead, I walked as quickly and quietly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every snapped twig or rustling leaf. I kept thinking about those footsteps and how whatever made them could probably outrun me without even trying. I stuck to the most open parts of my usual path, avoiding anywhere dense or shadowy. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw our backyard, I nearly cried with relief. Mom didn't notice anything wrong when I came in. She was busy with Molly, who had finally fallen asleep on the couch. I went straight to my room and closed the door. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell anyone for years. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept my blinds closed tight and pushed my dresser in front of my bedroom door. Every noise outside made me jump. I was convinced that thing had followed me home, that it was watching our house, waiting. I didn't go back to those woods alone for the rest of that summer. When school started, I made excuses to take the long way home that avoided going near the tree line. By winter, I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined it or exaggerated what I'd seen. But I hadn't. 3 years later, when I was 14, my brother Kevin and I were staying up late watching TV. Our parents had gone to bed, and we were talking about random stuff. Somehow we got on the topic of the woods behind our house, and I don't know what made me do it, but I told him. I told him everything about that day by the creek. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. About a year before my experience, when he was 13, he'd been coming home from a friend's house at dusk. He took a shortcut through the edge of the woods and saw something standing between the trees. He said it was tall, taller than any man he'd ever seen, and it was just watching him. He ran home and never told anyone. 2 separate sightings, same woods, same reaction from the forest going silent. That's when I knew for sure I hadn't imagined it. Years later, after college, I did some research. Turns out Clearfield County has a history of strange sightings going back decades. People reported seeing large upright creatures in the woods, hearing unusual sounds at night, finding footprints too big to be human. Most people don't talk about it openly. Around here, that's a good way to get yourself labeled as crazy. I've spent countless hours trying to make sense of what I saw that day. Was it a Sasquatch? Bigfoot? Some kind of undiscovered species? I don't know. What I do know is that it was real. It was intelligent, and it was aware of me even if it didn't approach me directly. Sometimes I wonder if it spared me because I was just a kid, or if it was simply passing through and had no interest in me. I've never gone back to that exact spot by the creek, even though we still owned that house, until my parents sold it in 2002. What keeps me up at night, even now, is wondering how many times it might have watched me before I noticed it that day. How many times had I played in those woods, completely oblivious to something massive tracking my movements from a distance? I've since moved to Pittsburgh, and I rarely go hiking anymore. I can't stand being in dense woods where visibility is limited. When I do go outdoors, I'm constantly scanning my surroundings, listening for that telltale silence that means something is watching. My husband thinks I just had a scary childhood experience that my imagination blew out of proportion. He's probably right. That would be the rational explanation. But rational explanations don't explain why the birds and insects all went silent at once. They don't explain what my brother saw, and they don't explain the dreams I still have, where I'm sitting on that rock by the creek, and instead of passing by on the ridge, the thing turns and starts walking directly toward me. I'll never forget the way it moved, so deliberate, so quiet for its size, like it belonged in those woods more than I ever did, like it had been there long before humans built homes on the edge of its territory and would be there long after we were gone. I don't have proof. I don't have pictures or footprint casts or hair samples. All I have is what I saw and felt that day, and the absolute certainty that whatever it wasn't human. And sometimes on nights when the wind blows just right through the trees outside my bedroom window, I could swear I hear those heavy, measured footsteps again, and I know it's still out there. Story 12. I've gone back and forth about whether to share this for a long time. Most people would think I'm crazy or making this up. I'm not. I've been hunting for over 20 years, and I've never experienced anything like what happened to me in November of 2019. Even now, typing this makes my hands shake a little. I'm an experienced hog hunter. I know the woods of central Florida like the back of my hand, especially around the Kissimmee River area. I've tracked and hunted hogs there for years without incident. This particular day started like any other hunt. I headed out before dawn, parked my truck at my usual spot, and hiked in to set up near an oak stand surrounded by palmettos. It was a good area where I'd had success before. The morning was uneventful. I saw a few small game animals, but no hogs. By early afternoon, I decided to move further down the river to another spot where I'd seen hog activity the previous week. The weather was perfect, not too hot, with a light breeze. I packed up my gear and started walking, following game trails that ran parallel to the river. About a mile into my hike, I noticed something strange. The woods had gone completely silent. Anyone who spends time outdoors knows that silence in the forest is unnatural and usually means something is wrong. Normally, you'd hear birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling. The background noise you get so used to that you don't even notice it until it's gone. But suddenly there was nothing, just dead silence. I stopped walking and listened, thinking maybe a predator was nearby, a panther or bear perhaps. That's when I heard it for the first time. Heavy, deliberate footsteps behind me, maybe 30 or 40 yards back. They were spaced out, slow, and much heavier than any deer or hog would make. Whatever it was had some serious weight to it. I turned around but couldn't see anything through the thick brush. I started walking again, and after a few steps, I heard the footsteps resume. When I stopped, they stopped too. This happened 3 or 4 times, and I realized whatever was following me was mimicking my movements, a behavior no normal animal would display. My first thought was that another hunter was messing with me, but that didn't make sense. The footsteps were too heavy, and who would follow someone like that without announcing themselves? Plus, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind me was walking on 2 legs, not 4. I picked up my pace, trying to get to a clearing where I could see better. That's when I heard a deep guttural grunt from behind me, not like a hog but deeper and rougher. Before I could process what I'd heard, another similar grunt answered from my right, maybe 50 yards away. Then a third grunt came from further ahead to my left. My blood ran cold. I was being surrounded by multiple somethings. They were coordinating, communicating with each other, and I was in the middle of it. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared. 20 years in these woods, and I'd never experienced anything remotely like this. I decided to find higher ground to get a better look at what was stalking me. About 100 yards ahead was a slight rise near the riverbank. I moved toward it as quietly as I could, my rifle ready. Every few steps, I'd hear the footsteps or a branch breaking, always just out of sight. The sounds were coming from multiple directions now, confirming my fear that there was more than one. When I reached the rise, I crouched down behind a fallen tree and scanned the area I'd just come through. For several minutes, I saw nothing. Then something moved in the brush about 40 yards back. At first, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but as I focused, I realized I was looking at something I couldn't explain. Through a gap in the vegetation, I could make out a massive bipedal figure covered in reddish-brown hair. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more, and incredibly wide across the shoulders and chest. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down past where its knees would be. The creature's body looked powerful, with thick muscles visible even under the hair. I caught glimpses of its face as it turned its head, scanning the area. It wasn't a bear's face. It was flatter, more humanoid, but not human. I could see eyes set deep under a heavy brow ridge. Its nose was wide and flat, and its jaw was prominent. The proportions were all wrong for a human face. Too large, too wide. As I watched, frozen in place, the creature suddenly turned its head and looked directly at where I was hiding. I don't know if it saw me or smelled me, but in that moment I felt like prey. It knew exactly where I was. Then it did something that confirmed these weren't animals. It deliberately grunted, loud and clear, almost like a signal. Immediately, another grunt answered from somewhere to my right, out of sight. They were communicating about me. I was being hunted. My training kicked in, and I assessed my options. I was about 2 miles from my truck. If I tried to shoot one of them, the others would likely attack. And I didn't know how many there were, or if my rifle would even stop something that size. Running seemed like my only option. I took a deep breath and started moving rapidly toward the direction of my truck, no longer concerned about being quiet. As soon as I moved, I heard activity explode behind me. Heavy footsteps, breaking branches, and more of those grunts. They were following me, keeping pace just out of sight. What happened next still haunts me. As I ran, I could hear them on either side of me, paralleling my path, but staying in the thicker brush. They were herding me, not rushing to attack, but methodically pushing me in a specific direction, toward the edge of their territory, I now believe. Occasionally one would grunt, and another would answer, like they were coordinating their positions. At one point, I had to cross a small clearing. As I reached the middle, I heard heavy breathing and footsteps rapidly approaching from behind. I spun around, rifle raised, and caught a glimpse of one of the creatures, just as it ducked back into the tree line. It had been right behind me, close enough that I could hear its breathing, but it retreated when I turned. It wasn't trying to attack me. It was herding me, pushing me forward. I've never run so fast in my life. Every few seconds, I'd hear branches breaking or heavy footfalls, always just out of clear sight. They were incredibly stealthy for their size. Once, I heard what sounded like knuckles hitting a tree trunk. 3 distinct knocks, followed by a grunt from further ahead. They were signaling each other, coordinating. After what felt like forever but was probably 20 minutes of terrified running, I finally saw my truck through the trees. I sprinted the last 100 yards, fumbling for my keys as I ran. As I reached the vehicle, something made me turn around for one last look. There, at the edge of the woods about 60 yards away, stood one of the creatures in plain view. It was even larger than I'd first thought, well over 7 feet tall, with a massive barrel chest and powerful limbs. It wasn't hiding anymore. It stood there, watching me intently, its dark eyes fixed on mine. We stared at each other for what must have been 30 seconds but felt much longer. I had my rifle, but I couldn't move. There was intelligence in those eyes, not animal intelligence, something else. It wasn't threatening me now that I was leaving. It was making sure I left. Finally, it turned and walked back into the forest, its gait smooth and upright, not like a bear or any animal I've ever seen. It disappeared into the trees, and seconds later, I heard a long, low howl from deep in the woods that was answered by at least 2 others from different directions. I jumped in my truck, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I've never gone back to that spot again. I've been a hunter and outdoorsman my whole life. I know the wildlife in Florida. What I encountered that day wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a suit, and wasn't any known animal. The way they coordinated, the way they communicated, the way they deliberately herded me out of their territory, it showed intelligence and purpose. I'm convinced I encountered multiple Sasquatch or Bigfoot creatures that day. They considered that area their territory, and they wanted me out of it. They could have attacked me at any point but chose instead to escort me out. I haven't told many people this story. My wife knows, and a couple of close hunting buddies. Most people look at you like you're crazy when you talk about Bigfoot. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to me. Those creatures exist, and they're far more intelligent and organized than most people realize. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in that part of the Kissimmee River area. Sometimes at night, I still hear those grunts in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat. Whatever those creatures were, they let me go that day. I don't intend to test their patience again. Story 13. It was the 2nd week of November, prime hunting season in Virginia. I'd been going to the same general area in Jefferson for years, knew those woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. The weather was perfect that morning, cold enough that you could see your breath, but not so bitter that you couldn't sit still for hours. I remember checking the forecast repeatedly the night before, making sure conditions would be ideal. I had set up my ground blind about 3 days earlier to let any scent dissipate. It was a good spot, tucked against a small ridge with a clear view of a game trail that crossed a natural funnel between 2 thicker sections of forest. I'd seen plenty of deer moving through there in previous seasons. I got to my spot well before sunrise, maybe around 5 in the morning. The drive-in had been quiet, and I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. I parked about a mile from my blind and hiked in with my gear. My Remington .308, some water, a sandwich, and just the basics. I wasn't planning on staying out past mid-afternoon. The morning was uneventful. I saw a couple of does around 7:30, but nothing I wanted to take. By around 11, I'd eaten my sandwich and was just sitting there, scanning the woods, enjoying being outdoors. That's one thing about hunting that non-hunters don't always get. Sometimes it's just about being out there, being patient, being part of the forest for a while. It was around 1 in the afternoon when everything changed. I remember checking my watch and thinking I'd give it another hour before calling it a day. The woods had been normal all morning. Birds calling, the occasional squirrel rustling around, wind in the trees. Then suddenly, everything went silent, and I mean completely silent. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the forest. Any hunter will tell you that when the woods go quiet, something's up. Usually it means a predator is moving through, a coyote, maybe a bear. But this was different. This was absolute silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I sat up straighter in my blind, all my senses suddenly on high alert. The silence alone was making the hair on my neck stand up. That's when I felt it, a vibration through the ground. Not like an earthquake, more like heavy footsteps, but rhythmic and powerful enough that I could feel them through the earth. My coffee thermos was actually vibrating slightly on the small folding table I had set up. The vibrations got stronger, and I remember gripping my rifle tighter, though I wasn't even sure what I was preparing for. I was looking in the direction the vibrations seemed to be coming from, a thicker section of trees about 30 yards from my blind. And then it emerged from the tree line. I've spent 20+ years in those woods. I've seen black bears, coyotes, all kinds of wildlife. What stepped out of those trees wasn't anything I recognized from any field guide or nature show. It was massive, standing well over 8 feet tall. Its body was incredibly broad, with a chest that seemed almost twice as wide as a large man's. What struck me immediately was how solid it looked. Not fat, but powerfully built, like a linebacker, but several times larger. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, swinging slightly as it moved. The thing was covered in hair, not fur like a bear, but hair, dark brown or nearly black, and thicker around the shoulders and upper arms. Its face. God, its face is what convinced me this wasn't someone in a suit playing a prank. The skin was a grayish color, where it showed through on the face, with wide, flat features and a heavy brow that shadowed its eyes. It looked ancient and intelligent and completely wild all at once. For a moment, it just stood there at the edge of the clearing, and I sat frozen in my blind. I couldn't even think to raise my rifle. Not that I would have shot at it anyway. Something told me that would have been the worst mistake I could make. It seemed to be surveying the area, turning its head slowly from side to side. I don't know if it had spotted my blind yet, but I was praying it wouldn't. The blind was camouflaged to blend with the surroundings. But this thing, it seemed to be taking in everything. Then it happened. It turned its head directly toward my blind and went completely still. I swear it was looking right at me, even though I should have been hidden. I held my breath, trying not to move a muscle, hoping it would lose interest and move on. Instead, it did something that still gives me nightmares. It roared, but calling it a roar doesn't do it justice. It was deep and violent and so powerful that I physically felt it hit my body like a wave. The walls of my blind actually shuddered. It was partly a roar, partly a scream, and it contained a rage that seemed to fill the entire forest. Before I could even process what was happening, it charged directly at my blind. Full speed. You know how they say time slows down in moments of extreme stress? That's exactly what happened. I could see every detail as it ran, how its muscles moved under all that hair, how its feet tore up the ground, how its face contorted with what looked like absolute fury. It covered those 30 yards in seconds. When it reached my blind, it didn't try to tear the roof off or reach in through the windows. It slammed its shoulder into the wall right next to where I was sitting. The whole structure cracked and tilted. I was thrown against the opposite wall, my rifle clattering to the floor. It hit the blind again, and I heard the support start to snap. The wall beside me was buckling inward, the material tearing. I scrambled to the other side of the blind, my back pressed against the far wall, watching as the thing hit my blind a third time. The wall partially collapsed, creating a jagged opening, and then, God, I can barely think about this part. It reached in. Its arm came through that opening, massive hand groping around inside the blind. The hand was huge, easily big enough to wrap around my entire head, with thick fingers ending in what looked like dark, heavy nails. Not quite claws, but not human fingernails either. The smell hit me then. It was powerful and distinctive, sour and earthy, like wet vegetation mixed with something musky and animal. Not exactly like anything I'd smelled before, but primitive and wild. I pressed myself as far back as I could, trying not to make a sound even though my breathing was coming in short, panicked gasps. Its arm withdrew, and for a moment I thought maybe it was giving up. Then its face appeared in the opening. It pushed its head partially through the torn wall, and we were face to face, maybe 4 feet apart. Its eyes were dark under that heavy brow, intelligent and filled with what I can only describe as territorial rage. Its mouth was slightly open, and I could see its teeth, thick and yellowed, clearly stained from a lifetime of eating whatever it could find in the forest. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. I was completely frozen, certain I was about to die. I remember thinking about my wife and kids, wondering if anyone would ever find what was left of me, or if this thing would drag me off into the forest where I'd never be found. Then something changed in its expression. I can't explain it exactly, but the rage seemed to dim slightly. It let out a low rumble, not a roar this time, but something quieter, almost like a warning. Its breath hit my face, hot and carrying that same wild smell, and then, to my utter disbelief, it backed away. It withdrew its head from the opening, stood up straight, and just looked at the damaged blind for a moment. Then it turned and walked away, not running, not charging, just walking deliberately back toward the tree line it had come from. I didn't move for at least 10 minutes after it disappeared into the trees. I couldn't, my legs wouldn't work. I just sat there shaking uncontrollably, listening for any sign that it was coming back. When I finally managed to get to my feet, I grabbed my rifle and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't even bother collecting all my gear, just took my rifle and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to feel that thing's hand grab me from behind at any moment. I never went back for the rest of my equipment. I couldn't bring myself to go anywhere near that spot again. I reported what happened to the Forest Service, but I could tell from their faces they thought I'd seen a bear and panicked, or that I was making it up entirely. I stopped telling people after a while because the disbelief was almost worse than the experience itself. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was something else, something that has probably been living in those mountains for centuries. And the most chilling part to me, even now, is that it could have killed me easily. But it chose not to. It was like it was sending me a message, making it clear that I wasn't welcome in its territory. I still hunt, but never in Jefferson National Forest and never alone, and I'm always listening for that silence in the woods, that unnatural quiet that comes right before something impossible steps out of the trees. Story 14. I still can't explain what happened that night at Racetown Lake. It's been 4 years since September of 2019, and I haven't gone night fishing alone since. I've replayed the events in my head thousands of times, questioned my own sanity, and searched for logical explanations. But nothing makes sense except the impossible. I've always been an outdoors guy. Duck hunting, fishing, hiking, you name it. Never been afraid of the woods or being alone at night. Hell, I practically grew up in the wilderness. My dad taught me everything about the outdoors from the time I could walk. So when I decided to go catfishing by myself on the west shore of Racetown Lake that night, it was nothing unusual. I arrived around 7 in the evening with plans to fish through the night. September nights in those parts get cool, but not uncomfortable. I had my thermos of coffee, some sandwiches, and all my gear. Found a nice spot where I'd had luck before, a little clearing near the water with a fallen log I could sit on, perfect for setting up my lines. The first few hours were completely uneventful. I caught a couple small catfish, nothing worth keeping, just enjoying the peace, you know. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light that I only needed my flashlight occasionally. Stars were out in force, reflecting on the water. It was beautiful, serene. Around 11, I started noticing something odd. It took me a while to figure out what was bothering me. Then it hit me. The sound, or rather the lack of it. If you've spent any time outdoors at night, you know there's always noise. Crickets chirping, frogs croaking, occasional rustling in the underbrush, but suddenly there was nothing. Just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the slight breeze through the trees. That kind of silence usually means one thing in the wild: predator. Something big enough to make the little critters shut up and hide. My first thought was bear, maybe mountain lion. Nothing unusual for these parts, but definitely something to be aware of. I grabbed my flashlight and did a slow sweep of the tree line behind me. Nothing seemed out of place. No glowing eyes, no movement. I scanned across the water too, thinking maybe someone had come up in a boat, but the lake surface was empty. I tried to shake off the uneasiness, told myself it was just my imagination working overtime, but I couldn't get comfortable again. The silence was oppressive, almost physical. I kept fishing, but my mind wasn't in it anymore. I was listening, straining to hear anything normal that would break that unnatural quiet. It must have been close to midnight when I felt it. It's hard to describe exactly, but the closest I can come is that feeling you get right before lightning strikes nearby. This crackling energy in the air that makes all the hair on your body stand up. My arms, neck, everything just electrified. It wasn't cold, but I started shivering. Something was watching me. I knew it with absolute certainty. I turned slowly, planning to gather my gear and get the hell out of there. That's when I saw it. About 30 feet away, behind some brush and partially hidden by a downed tree, something was crouched low to the ground. At first, I only caught the reflection of eyes at the edge of my flashlight beam. Then, as I adjusted the light, I could make out more. Whatever it was massive. Even hunched down like it was, I could tell it was big. Probably as tall as me if it stood up. It had these impossibly wide shoulders and a thick, muscular-looking body. What hit me hardest was that it was covered in dark hair, black or maybe very dark brown, hard to tell in the limited light. Its head looked weirdly large, almost too big for the body, and it sat low between those shoulders, almost like it didn't have much of a neck. We just stared at each other. I swear to God, it felt like a full minute passed with neither of us moving. My light was shaking so bad because my hand was trembling, but I couldn't look away. There was intelligence in those eyes. Not animal intelligence. Something else. Something that knew exactly what I was and was making calculations. Finally, it shifted slightly. Not toward me, thank God, but backward a bit, still staying in that crouched position. That tiny movement broke my paralysis. I started backing toward my truck, which was parked maybe 50 yards behind me. I kept my flashlight trained on the creature the whole time, expecting any second for it to charge me, but it didn't move. It just watched me retreat. I've never been so aware of every step, every breath. The crunch of leaves under my feet sounded like explosions in that silence. I was afraid to turn my back, so I kept walking backward until I felt the truck behind me. Even then, I fumbled for the door handle without looking, keeping my eyes on that spot where the creature was hiding. When I finally got inside the truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. It took 3 tries the whole time I was watching, expecting to see that thing running at me from the darkness. I turned the key and hit the headlights. Nothing was there anymore, at least nothing I could see. The creature had vanished. I don't know if it retreated further into the woods or moved to another position. I didn't stick around to find out. I drove home way too fast on those winding lake roads, almost went off the shoulder twice because I kept checking my rearview mirror. When I got home, my dad was still up watching late-night TV. One look at my face and he knew something was wrong. I told him everything. To his credit, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. My dad spent his whole life in those woods too, and he's heard stories. He didn't have answers, but he believed that I believed what I saw, if that makes sense. The next day, in the clarity of morning, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear standing weird. Maybe it was some guy in a ghillie suit playing a sick joke. But neither explanation fit what I saw. Bears don't move like that, don't look like that, and no human I've ever seen has shoulders that wide or a build that massive. I went back a week later, in daylight with my buddy Mike, to look for tracks or signs. We found some broken branches and what might have been a large footprint in some soft ground, but it had rained in the meantime, so nothing conclusive. Mike thought I was crazy, but he came along anyway. Since that night, I've done a lot of research. Read accounts from other people who've seen similar things. Some call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I don't know what label to put on it, but I know what I saw wasn't normal. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal that's supposed to exist in these parts. And it sure as hell wasn't human. It was something in between, something covered in hair, moving with purpose, hiding but observing. I still fish at Racetown Lake, but I never stay after dark anymore. And I always carry my gun in the truck now. Not that I think a gun would do much good against something that size, but it makes me feel better. The thing that haunts me most is the intelligence I felt from that creature. It wasn't just watching me, it was studying me. And sometimes I get this crazy feeling that it's still out there, that it remembers me like I remember it. I don't know why it didn't approach me that night. Maybe it was as curious about me as I was terrified of it. Maybe it wasn't hungry. Maybe there's some kind of understanding between our species that keeps them hidden and us safe. All I know is that the woods don't feel the same anymore. When I'm out there now, I'm always listening for that unnatural silence, always watching the tree line, always wondering if I'm being watched in return. The worst part is not knowing what it was exactly, not knowing if anyone will believe me, not knowing if I'll ever see it again, or if next time it might not be content to just watch from a distance. So that's my story. I don't expect you to believe me. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I believe myself. But I know what I saw that night at Racetown Lake, and whatever it was, it doesn't belong in any wildlife guide I've ever read. Story 15. I've never shared this story in a public space before. I'm 60 now, but what happened back in the summer of '82 still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I've told this to friends and family over the years, and most just give me that look, you know the one, like I'm spinning some tall tale for attention. But I swear on everything I care about, what I'm about to tell you is exactly what happened. I was 16 that summer, full of that teenage invincibility that makes you think nothing bad could ever happen to you. My buddy Jake and I had been looking forward to our camping trip with my stepbrother Mark for weeks. Mark was 25 and the coolest guy I knew, drove a beat-up Ford Bronco, worked construction, and always had these wild stories about his outdoor adventures. We were headed to a spot near Traverse City in Grand Traverse County, Michigan. It was beautiful country up there, dense forests, clear streams, and enough isolation to make you feel like you were the only people for miles around, which, as it turns out, we weren't. The ride-up was filled with our usual teenage bullshit, talking about girls from school, complaining about our parents, that kind of stuff. But about an hour into the drive, Mark got unusually quiet. When I asked him what was up, he hesitated before telling us about the last time he'd been to this particular spot. "I was with a couple buddies from work," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "We'd been drinking a bit, but I swear we weren't wasted or anything. Something started circling our campsite around midnight, making these sounds." "What kind of sounds?" Jake asked from the back seat, already looking nervous. Mark shrugged. "Hard to describe. Not quite human, not quite animal. Low and sort of purposeful. We tried to convince ourselves it was just a bear or something, but bears don't circle a camp for hours." He went on to tell us that they'd gotten so freaked out they'd actually abandoned their camping gear in the middle of the night and hightailed it back to the car. They'd come back the next morning to retrieve everything, but Mark said he'd never felt comfortable there again. "So why are we going there?" I asked, feeling that first twinge of uneasiness. Because it's beautiful land, and I've been there a dozen times before with no problems. That was probably just a one-off weird night, Mark said, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. Besides, we've got the three of us now. In retrospect, I should have pushed harder to go somewhere else. But I was 16, and the idea of possibly experiencing something spooky was more exciting than scary at that point. The turn-off to the camping spot was about 20 minutes down this rutted dirt road that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years. Mark's Bronco handled it okay, but we were still getting tossed around inside. The forest grew thicker the further in we went, sunlight filtering through the canopy in patchy spots. It felt like we were driving into another world entirely. We finally reached a small clearing that Mark said was perfect for camping. It was surrounded by dense woods on all sides, with a small creek about 50 yards to the east. The clearing itself was maybe 30 feet across, with these tall ferns growing everywhere, thigh-high on me, and I was nearly 6 feet tall then. We spent that afternoon setting up camp, gathering wood, and creating a proper fire pit with stones from around the creek. Mark showed us how to lay down fiddlehead ferns to create a softer surface for our sleeping bags. It was actually pretty comfortable, all things considered. As the sun started to set, we cooked hot dogs over the fire, and Mark broke out some beers he'd brought along. He let Jake and me each have one, making us feel grown up and cool. We stayed up telling ghost stories, which feels painfully ironic now, and eventually turned in around 11. I fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the day's activities. I don't know exactly what time it was when Jake's whispers woke me, but the fire had died down to embers, casting this eerie red glow across our campsite. "Brian," Jake hissed, poking my shoulder. "Brian, wake up. There's something out there." I blinked awake, disoriented. "What? What are you talking about?" "Something's walking around the camp," he insisted, his voice tight with fear. "I've been hearing it for the past 10 minutes. I sat up and listened, but all I could hear was the soft crackling of the dying fire and the distant hooting of an owl. "I don't hear anything, man." Mark stirred in his sleeping bag. "What's going on?" he mumbled. "Jake thinks something's walking around outside," I explained. Mark sat up too, listening intently for a moment before shaking his head. "Just your imagination, kid. Go back to sleep." Jake looked unconvinced but lay back down. I could tell he was still tense, but eventually we all drifted back to sleep. The next time I woke up, it was to Jake frantically shaking my shoulder. The sky was still dark, but it had that pre-dawn quality that told me it was probably around 5 in the morning. "It's back," Jake whispered, his face pale even in the dim light. "And it's by the car now." This time, Mark was already awake, sitting perfectly still in his sleeping bag. He held a finger to his lips, signaling for us to be quiet. That's when I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the direction of where we'd parked the Bronco, about 20 yards from our campsite. It wasn't the normal forest sounds I'd grown up with. This was deliberate movement, something large shifting its weight, followed by what sounded like something dragging across metal. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, feeling my heart start to hammer in my chest. Mark shook his head slowly, his eyes wide. "Don't know, but we're staying put until daylight." We sat there, frozen in our sleeping bags, for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes. The sounds continued off and on, movement around the perimeter of our clearing, never coming into the firelight, but never really going away either. Sometimes it would stop for 5 or 10 minutes, and we'd start to relax, thinking whatever it was had left. Then we'd hear a branch snap, or leaves rustle from a different direction. The worst was when we heard what sounded like heavy breathing. It wasn't like any animal I was familiar with, not a deer snort or bear huff. It was deep, rhythmic, and somehow intentional, like something was standing just beyond the reach of our vision, watching us and making sure we knew it was there. When the first hint of daylight finally appeared, we were all wide awake and on edge. The sounds had stopped about 20 minutes earlier, but none of us were willing to leave the relative safety of our campsite until we could clearly see our surroundings. As the forest gradually brightened with dawn, Mark finally stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. "Let's check it out," he said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in his voice. We cautiously moved toward the edge of our clearing, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ferns that surrounded our campsite had been disturbed, pressed down in a clear path that circled our entire camp. It wasn't just a random animal trail. Whatever had made this had systematically walked around our campsite, creating a perfect circle in the ferns. "Holy shit," Jake whispered, pointing at the path. "Look at that." Mark's face had gone pale. "Let's check the car," he said quietly. We followed him to where the Bronco was parked on the dirt road. The morning dew was still fresh on the ground, and there, pressed clearly into a patch of soft dirt next to the driver's side door, was a footprint. Not a bear print, not a deer track, a footprint. But it was massive, easily 16 or 17 inches long. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was incredibly heavy. "That's not human," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "That can't be human." Mark knelt down to examine it more closely. "No, it's not," he agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake had wandered a few feet away toward the creek. "Guys," he called, his voice shaking. "There's another one over here." We rushed over to find a second footprint, just as large as the first, pressed into the mud near the creek bank. This one was even clearer, showing what looked like 5 toes and an arch, just like a human foot, but at a scale that was impossible for any person. We stood there in stunned silence for a long moment, the reality of what we were looking at sinking in. Something had circled our camp all night long. Something massive had been watching us sleep, probably standing just feet away from us at times. "We need to go," Mark finally said, and neither Jake nor I argued. We packed up our campsite in record time, constantly glancing over our shoulders and jumping at every sound from the forest. The feeling of being watched never left, even as we loaded the last of our gear into the Bronco. The ride back was mostly silent. What was there to say? We'd all seen the evidence. The circular path through the ferns, the massive footprints. As we got closer to civilization, Mark finally spoke up. "I don't think we should talk about this with anyone else," he said. "They'll just think we're crazy." Jake nodded immediately, but I wasn't so sure. "But what if it was, a Bigfoot or something?" I asked, the word feeling ridiculous coming out of my mouth despite what we'd just experienced. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Maybe it was. All I know is I'm never going back to that spot again. I've thought about that night thousands of times over the years. I've read accounts from other people who've had similar experiences. I've even gone back to that general area a few times as an adult, though never to that exact spot. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I'm 60 years old now, and I've seen and experienced a lot in my life. But nothing has ever shaken me like that night in the woods. Whatever was circling our camp, whatever left those massive footprints, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any normal forest animal either. I still get chills when I think about how close it must have been while we slept, how easily it could have come into our camp if it wanted to. Why it just circled us, watching, waiting, I'll never know. But I'm certain of what I saw, and no amount of rational explanation has ever been able to convince me otherwise. Something was in those woods with us that night, something that shouldn't exist, but does. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night and hear an unexpected sound outside my window, I can't help but wonder if it's found me again. Story 16. I still get goosebumps when I think about what happened to me 5 years ago. I was 16 at the time, volunteering as a counselor at this day camp near the Molalla River in Oregon. It was supposed to be a normal summer job. something to put on college applications and make a little spending money. I never expected it would completely change how I see the world. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. The main activities for the day had wrapped up early because of the heat, and most of the kids were doing indoor crafts with the other counselors. My buddy Marcus and I were assigned cleanup duty around the outdoor pavilion area. After we finished, we had about an hour and a half before we needed to help with dinner prep. "Dude, let's go check out that spot I was telling you about," Marcus said, wiping sweat from his forehead. He'd been talking about this cool creek he'd found earlier in the week. I was bored and hot, so I agreed. We grabbed our backpacks with our lunches that we hadn't had time to eat yet, and headed out. The main camp area was this cleared section with cabins and activity areas. But beyond that were hundreds of acres of dense Oregon forest. I'd grown up hiking these kinds of woods, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. We walked maybe half a mile from camp, following what looked like an old game trail. The further we went, the thicker the woods got. The tall Douglas firs blocked out most of the sunlight, and the ground changed from the dry, needle-covered soil near camp to this spongy, almost swampy terrain. Little muddy creeks crisscrossed through the area, and the air felt heavier, that distinctive smell of wet earth and decomposing leaves. Marcus pointed out this fallen log, about 60 feet from one of the wider creek sections. "Perfect lunch spot," he said, and I agreed. It was peaceful there, with just the sounds of water trickling over rocks and birds calling overhead. We sat down, and I pulled out my squished peanut butter sandwich. Then Marcus slapped his forehead. "Shit, I forgot my water bottle back at camp, and I think my phone too." He stood up, brushing off his shorts. "I'm gonna run back and grab it." "You good here?" I nodded, mouthful of sandwich. "Yeah, no problem, I'll save your spot," I joked. He jogged back the way we came, and suddenly I was alone in the woods. I didn't think anything of it at first. I just sat there eating, enjoying the rare quiet after days of non-stop kid chaos at camp. I remember checking my watch after a few minutes. He'd been gone maybe 7 minutes when I heard something. It was a sound to my left, maybe 50 yards away. Not like the normal forest noises I was used to, not a squirrel or a bird. This was heavier. A snapping branch, then what sounded like something large moving through the underbrush. My first thought was bear. We'd had safety briefings about black bears in the area. They usually avoid people, but I stood up anyway, thinking I should make some noise to scare it off. That's when I saw it. About 50 feet away, partially hidden behind this massive old cedar tree was... I don't even know how to describe it accurately. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. This thing was huge. I'm 5'9", and this creature was towering, probably around 8 feet tall, but it wasn't just the height that made my blood run cold. It was the way it stood, completely upright on 2 legs, with a posture that was eerily human-like. Its body was massive, not fat, but built like a bodybuilder gone extreme. Shoulders wider than any human I've ever seen, with thick arms hanging down. The entire body was covered in this dense, long fur, a dark brown color, almost black in the shadowy forest. The fur wasn't matted or dirty like you might expect from a wild animal. It looked maintained in a way. But what I remember most clearly, what still haunts me when I close my eyes, was the face. It was set forward in a pronounced brow, with deep-set eyes beneath. Not animal eyes. These had intelligence in them, awareness. Those eyes locked with mine, and for what felt like forever but was probably just 3 or 4 seconds, we stared at each other. Its expression changed as it looked at me. I swear I'm not making this up. I could read the emotions crossing its face. First surprise, like it hadn't expected to encounter anyone. Then something like confusion or curiosity. It tilted its head slightly, as if trying to figure out what exactly I was. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, sandwich forgotten in my hand, as this impossible creature and I regarded each other across the forest clearing. Then, without any warning, it moved. The creature took one deliberate step sideways, disappearing behind the cedar tree. What happened next is burned into my memory. The sound of it moving through the forest was unlike anything I've ever heard. Not the casual rustling of a deer or even the determined push of a bear. This was powerful, deliberate destruction. Each footstep sounded like someone dropping a bowling ball from height. The ground, I swear to God, the ground trembled. I could feel the vibrations through my shoes. Branches snapped like gunshots, underbrush crushed and flattened. Whatever this thing was, it was running away from me at incredible speed, especially considering the density of the forest. The sound of its retreat continued for maybe 10 seconds, growing fainter as it covered an impossible amount of ground. When I couldn't hear it anymore, my survival instinct finally kicked in. I dropped my sandwich and ran, faster than I've ever run in my life, back toward camp. My mind was racing with confusion and fear. What the hell had I just seen? It couldn't be what I thought it was. Those things aren't real. They're campfire stories, not creatures you actually encounter in the woods on a Wednesday afternoon. I ran smack into Marcus on the trail, nearly knocking us both over. "Whoa, dude, what's wrong?" he asked, grabbing my shoulders to steady me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I was breathing so hard I could barely speak. "We need to go back, now," I managed to gasp out. "What happened? Are you okay?" I couldn't form the words to explain. How do you tell someone you just had a staring contest with Bigfoot without sounding completely insane? So I lied. "I think I saw a bear," I said. "A big one, really close." Marcus's eyes widened. "Shit, for real? Let's get back to camp." We jogged back together, and I tried to process what had happened. By the time we reached camp, I'd almost convinced myself I had seen a bear, that my mind had played tricks on me in the moment of fear. Almost. But I knew what I saw. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, the way it stood, the intelligence in those eyes, the deliberate way it moved behind the tree before fleeing. None of that matched any animal I knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying those few seconds over and over. The next morning, I made an excuse to the camp director about feeling sick and got a ride back to town. I couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods. For weeks afterward, I researched online, looking at stories from others who claimed similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. So many details matched what I experienced: the height, the build, the intelligence in the eyes, the incredible speed and power when moving through dense forest. I found whole communities of people who've had encounters like mine, many of them in the same general region. I've never told anyone the full truth about what happened that day. Not my parents, not my friends. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled the crazy kid who thinks he saw Bigfoot. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't human. And it wasn't any recognized animal either. What haunts me most isn't just the creature itself, but the look in its eyes. There was something so aware in that gaze, like two intelligent species from completely different worlds suddenly finding each other in the woods. I got the distinct feeling it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. 5 years have passed, and I've never gone back to that specific area. I still hike, but never alone, and never in the more remote parts of Oregon forests. Sometimes when I'm out in nature and hear an unexpected branch snap, my heart rate spikes, and I'm instantly transported back to that moment. I don't know what to call what I saw that day. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some undiscovered species. The label doesn't really matter. What matters is that there's something out there in the woods that science hasn't explained. Something intelligent that moves through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, mostly unseen, occasionally crossing paths with humans like me. I often wonder if it remembers our encounter the way I do. If somewhere in those forests, there's a creature that once looked into the eyes of a skinny 16-year-old boy and was just as confused and startled by the experience as I was. The world is stranger than we know. I learned that lesson on a summer afternoon by a muddy creek in the Malala River woods, and nothing has felt quite the same since. Story 17. I've been hesitant to share this experience for years. Most people would just laugh it off or tell me I was seeing things, but I know what happened that day in October of 2006. I know what my kids saw. And I know why none of us will ever hunt in that part of Lincoln County again. I've been hunting the Wisconsin woods since I was old enough to hold a rifle. My dad taught me, just like his dad taught him. It's something special to pass down to your kids, not just the hunting itself, but respecting nature, understanding the woods, knowing what's out there. At least I thought I knew what was out there until that day. It was youth deer season, and I'd taken my son Jason, 14 at the time, and my daughter Sarah, 12, to a private piece of land about 10 miles west of Tomahawk. We'd hunted there before. Nothing special, just mixed pine and hardwoods with some old logging roads connecting everything. The landowner was a buddy from work who let me use it during hunting season. We got out there early, around 5:30 in the morning. It was cool but clear, perfect hunting weather. I remember there was this mist hanging low over the field as we parked the truck. I helped the kids with their orange vests, and we went through the safety checklist like always. Jason had been hunting with me for 3 seasons already, but this was only Sarah's second time out. She was more interested in just being outdoors than actually shooting anything. We walked along the edge of the woods for maybe half an hour, keeping quiet, pointing out tracks when we saw them. It was around 7 when Jason spotted a young buck about 60 yards ahead of us, moving from the field toward the tree line. He took the shot. It was a good one, but the deer bolted into the woods. That happens sometimes, even with a clean hit. The deer runs on adrenaline before it goes down. We got him, Dad. Jason was so excited. I was proud of him. It was a clean shot, and we could see blood on the trail leading into the trees. Let's give it a few minutes, I told them. Then we'll follow the blood trail. He won't get far. We waited about 15 minutes, then started following the trail into the woods. That's when things started getting weird. The blood trail was easy enough to follow, but almost immediately after we entered the tree line, I heard it. A strange knocking sound coming from deeper in the forest. At first I thought maybe it was a woodpecker, but it was too deep, too heavy. It sounded like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Knock, knock, then silence, then 2 or 3 more. Dad, what's that? Sarah asked, moving closer to me. Probably just another hunter, I said, but I didn't believe it. No hunter would make that kind of noise. It would scare off every deer for half a mile. We kept following the blood trail, but the knocking continued, getting louder. Then there were crashing sounds ahead of us, like something big moving through the underbrush. The vegetation about 70 yards ahead was shaking violently. Whatever was making that movement was big, way bigger than a deer. My instincts were screaming at me to get the kids out of there. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something isn't right, but I tried to stay calm for their sake. I think we should head back, I said casually, trying not to alarm them. That deer might have gone further than we thought. But Dad, we hit it good, Jason protested. The blood trail's right here. I know, buddy, but something doesn't feel right. We can come back later with better light. The kids must have heard the tension in my voice because they didn't argue. As we turned around, the knocking sounds changed. They got faster, more urgent. It felt like we were being watched. We followed our own tracks back toward the field edge and the truck. That's when the smell hit us. Jesus Christ, that smell. I've field-dressed hundreds of deer. I've come across rotting carcasses in the woods. But this was different. It was like rotting meat mixed with something musky and wild, so strong you could almost taste it. Oh my God, what is that? Sarah covered her nose with her shirt. I'm gonna throw up. The smell got stronger as we got closer to our truck, which made no sense. We should have been moving away from whatever dead thing was causing it. My hand instinctively tightened on my rifle. I kept the kids close, my eyes scanning the tree line. We were maybe 20 yards from the truck when Jason grabbed my arm and pointed toward the woods behind us. Dad! He whispered urgently. Look! there's something in the tree! I turned, and that's when I saw it. Something large and dark dropping from a branch about 40 feet up in an old pine. I only caught a glimpse of it. Black hair, moving with surprising agility for something so big. It had apparently been watching us from above, following our movement, and was now coming down. "Get to the truck," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Now, we had just reached the truck when we heard it. A scream that still haunts my dreams. It wasn't human, wasn't like any animal I've ever heard in Wisconsin woods. It started low, then went high-pitched, echoing through the trees. Then more crashing, more vegetation movement, like whatever made that sound was moving parallel to the forest edge, keeping pace with us, but staying just inside the tree line. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely get the key in the ignition. The kids were silent, wide-eyed. I've never driven so fast down a logging road in my life. It wasn't until we were on the main highway that any of us spoke. Sarah was crying quietly. Jason kept looking back over his shoulder like he expected to see something following us. "What was that, Dad?" he finally asked. "I don't know," I said, but that was a lie. In that moment, I had a pretty good idea what we'd encountered, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Later that night, after the kids had calmed down, we talked about what we'd seen. Jason described seeing something about 6 feet tall with a wide, muscular build. He said its shoulders were incredibly broad, and its head seemed to connect directly to those shoulders, like it didn't have a neck. The hair was long, maybe 5 or 6 inches, and looked clean and thick across its entire body. Sarah said she never saw its face, just its back as it moved through the trees, but she noticed how it walked upright like a human. She was especially disturbed by how easily it had climbed down from such a high branch. "No bear could do that," she kept saying. "I've hunted Wisconsin my entire life. I know every animal in these woods: deer, black bear, wolves, coyotes. I know their tracks, their sounds, their habits. What we encountered that day doesn't match any known wildlife in this state. The combination of factors still haunts me. The strategic knocking sounds, the intimidation display of shaking vegetation, the incredible stench that seemed to intensify as the creature got closer, that unholy scream, and the physical description my kids gave. I've replayed it all in my head 1,000 times. A couple weeks later, I went back alone. I know, probably stupid. I had to see if there was any evidence. The deer Jason shot was gone, but that didn't surprise me. What did surprise me were the trees. Several had what looked like strike marks about 7 to 8 feet up, like something had hit them repeatedly with tremendous force. I found one footprint in some mud near the creek. It was around 16 inches long, human-shaped but wider, with 5 distinct toes. I took a picture, but it doesn't do it justice. You had to see how deep it was pressed into the ground to understand the weight behind it. I've kept this story mostly to myself until now. My hunting buddies would never let me live it down. My wife thinks we just spooked ourselves. But my kids, they know what they saw. Jason refuses to go hunting in Lincoln County now. Sarah has nightmares sometimes. I've since done some research, and apparently there have been other sightings in northern Wisconsin over the years. People talk about tree knocking, strange screams, the same putrid smell. They call it Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever. I used to laugh at those stories. I don't laugh anymore. The thing that gets me isn't just what we saw, but how it behaved. It seemed intelligent. The knocking sound started right after Jason's shot, like it was communicating our presence to others, the way it positioned itself above us, watching, the way it seemed to pace us as we retreated. It felt deliberate, territorial. I still hunt, but never there, and never without constantly looking over my shoulder. Sometimes when I'm in the woods alone now, I find myself listening for those knocks, and when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can still smell that stench. I don't know what's out there in those Lincoln County woods, but I know enough to stay away from it. Story 18. I've never really shared this before. Not fully. But it's been almost a year, and I still wake up some nights hearing those sounds, so maybe putting it down will help somehow. It was August of 2022 when my cousin Derek and I decided to go camping in the mountains northeast of Boise. We'd been talking about it for months, just getting away from everything for a weekend. No phones, no people, just us in the wilderness. Derek's always been the outdoorsy one between us. Me, not so much, but I wanted to reconnect with him after hardly seeing each other since the pandemic. We drove out early on a Friday morning in Derek's old Jeep Cherokee, loaded with our gear. The logging road we took was rough as hell, all washboarded dirt with rocks that kept scraping the undercarriage. About 8 miles in, we found this perfect spot. It was surrounded by these massive pines that blocked most of the sunlight, with a steep ridge behind us that dropped down to a creek. You could hear the water running if you stood still enough. The isolation was exactly what we wanted. No other campers, no day hikers, nothing. Setting up camp felt good. We pitched my 4-person North Face tent. Derek had forgotten his, so we shared mine. Built a fire pit with stones from the creek and strung up our food in a tree about 30 yards from our campsite. Basic stuff to keep bears away, you know. By mid-afternoon, we'd hiked up one of the ridges. The view was incredible. Just miles of undisturbed forest with the mountains rising in the distance. We didn't talk much during the hike, just enjoyed being out there. That evening, we grilled some steaks over the fire, drank a few beers, and talked about life. Derek had recently gone through a divorce, and this trip was partly to help him clear his head. We were both pretty beat from the drive and hike, so we turned in early, probably around 10. The forest was dead quiet except for the occasional distant owl. I fell asleep almost immediately in my sleeping bag, completely exhausted. Then suddenly I was wide awake. The first thing I noticed was Derek's hand gripping my arm. He was completely still, but I could feel him trembling slightly. That's when I heard it. Deep, methodical breathing just outside the tent wall, not an animal panting or the quick breaths of something small. This was slow, deliberate, powerful. Each breath sounded like it was being drawn from deep within a large chest. I checked my watch. It was around midnight. The moon was bright enough that I could make out Derek's silhouette beside me. His eyes were wide open, staring at the tent wall. Then it happened. Something struck the side of the tent with a flat, hard impact that made the whole structure shake. It wasn't like a branch falling or an animal bumping against it. This was intentional, like someone had slapped the tent with an open palm. The sound was unnervingly loud in the silence of the forest. I started to whisper something to Derek when 3 more strikes hit the tent wall right by our heads, slow, deliberate, methodical. Each one made the fabric bow inward slightly. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought whatever was out there might hear it. Then the footsteps started, heavy, crunching in the dirt and pine needles around us. The thing was circling our tent. The steps were spaced far apart, much wider than a normal human stride, and the weight behind them. You could feel the ground vibrate slightly with each step. I've been around bears before. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't slap tents systematically. They don't pace with that kind of deliberate rhythm. The footsteps stopped near the back of the tent, where our heads were. The breathing grew louder, closer, like whatever it was had positioned itself just inches from where we lay, separated only by the thin fabric of the tent. I could feel the warmth of Derek's arm against mine as we both lay completely still, barely breathing ourselves. It struck again, harder this time. Not just one slap, but a series of them. Open-handed, firm impacts that made the fabric bow inward each time. I remember thinking absurdly that if it hit much harder, the tent poles might snap. We didn't speak, didn't move. I'm not even sure we were breathing at that point. Pure, primal fear had taken over, the kind that freezes you completely. The entity began moving again, pacing around us in a wide circle. I could track its position just by the sound of those heavy, widely spaced footsteps. At one point I heard it over by our fire pit, the sound of something being shifted or picked up. Then a thud as something landed near our tent. We later found it was one of the smaller logs we'd gathered for the fire. It approached again. This time I could hear it sniffing at the fabric, making these short, powerful inhalations. Then came the slaps again, harder than before, rocking the entire tent structure. My mind was racing through possibilities. Bear, mountain lion, person. But nothing made sense. No animal behaves this way, and no person would be 8 miles down an abandoned logging road at midnight just to torment random campers. For what felt like forever, but was probably about an hour, this thing remained nearby. It never fully departed. Every few minutes, it would return to slap the tent once or twice, always in what seemed like a deliberate pattern. It wasn't random aggression. It felt calculated, like it was testing us, letting us know it was still there, still watching. The worst moment came when it stood near the front entrance of the tent. I saw the zipper shift slightly, like something had brushed against it. I remember thinking, "This is it. It's coming in." My whole body was trembling uncontrollably at that point. But instead, it let out this deep grunt, not quite a growl, lower and more guttural, and struck the tent one final time with such force that I thought the poles would give way. Then it started walking off into the woods, those heavy, widely spaced footsteps gradually fading until we couldn't hear them anymore. Neither of us moved for at least 30 minutes after the sounds disappeared. I don't think either of us even spoke until we saw the first hints of dawnlight filtering through the trees. When we finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent, the forest seemed unnervingly normal. Birds were starting to chirp. The early morning mist was rising from the ground. But something felt off. Like the whole place was holding its breath. Our campsite looked mostly undisturbed at first glance. The food bag we'd hung was still up in the tree, untouched. Our cooler hadn't been opened. But then we noticed the log, one of the smaller pieces of firewood we'd gathered, lying about 15 feet from where our woodpile had been. And in the soft dirt around our tent were shallow impressions, wide depressions spaced too far apart for any human stride I've ever seen. They weren't clear footprints, just compressed areas where something heavy had stood. We didn't say much as we packed up. Didn't need to. We both knew we weren't staying another night. The 8-mile drive back down that logging road was the longest of my life. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move. Every crack of a branch made us flinch. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway that Derek finally spoke. "That wasn't a bear," he said. It was all he needed to say. I've spent countless hours since then reading about wildlife encounters, watching videos of bears and mountain lions, trying to rationalize what happened. Nothing fits. No animal behaves that way, with that kind of deliberate intimidation, that pattern of interaction. It was like it was keeping us trapped inside that tent, demonstrating that it could get to us if it wanted to, but choosing not to. The only conclusion I keep coming back to is one I don't want to accept. But the more I think about those heavy, widely spaced footsteps, that deep breathing, the methodical way it tested our tent, the more I'm convinced we encountered something that shouldn't exist. Something that was intelligent enough to understand what it was doing to us psychologically. I haven't been camping since. Derek has, stubborn as he is, but never alone and never in that area again. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I still hear those footsteps circling, still feel the vibration of those slaps against the tent. And I wonder if somewhere in those Idaho mountains it remembers us too. I don't have proof. No photos, no recordings. Nothing but the memory of absolute terror and those vague depressions in the dirt. But I know what I experienced. And whatever was out there that night, it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in those woods.